Victorian novelist feel so, well, ahead of his time? To figure that out, we've got to look at how he totally blew up the traditional way of telling a story. And that brings us to the first big piece of the puzzle. He went inside the human mind. See, Meredith wasn't just about what his characters did. No, he was obsessed with what they were thinking and feeling deep down. This right here was a huge deal. I mean, we're talking long before writers like Virginia Woolf or James Joyce made it famous. Meredith was already playing with ways to get right inside a character's head. He wanted to show us all of it. The messy, unfiltered, even contradictory thoughts. The stuff that would basically define the modern novel in the 20th century. And just so we're all clear, that technique is called stream of consciousness. It's exactly what it sounds like. It tries to copy the way our minds actually work. Messy, jumping all over the place. For its time, this was, well, it was wild. A huge break from the neat, tidy stories Victorians were used to. And if you want a perfect, powerful example, look no further than his work, Modern Love. It's not actually a novel. It's a series of poems he wrote about his own very real, very painful divorce. It is just, wow. It's this masterpiece of psychological honesty, completely tearing down all the fluffy romantic ideas of the time to show the raw, ugly truth of a marriage breaking down. Okay, so let's check out his first big novel, The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, to see how he used this idea. The story is about a father who tries to raise his son based on this super strict scientific system. But, life happens. Love happens. Meredith's point was pretty loud and clear. You can't box in human nature. It's way too messy and passionate for rigid rules. This was a huge shot across the bow at the whole Victorian obsession with control. So this obsession with what's going on inside our heads, it wasn't just for writing personal dramas. Meredith weaponized it. He used it as a tool to critique the society he was living in, turning that sharp psychological focus on all of its flaws and ego trips. And you see this perfectly in what's probably his most famous novel, The Egoist. Seriously, it's considered his masterpiece for a reason. It is a brilliant, hilarious, and just utterly savage critique of selfishness, particularly the male ego. The whole story really boils down to this clash of perspectives. You've got Sir Willoughby Patterney, who thinks he's God's gift to the world, the perfect man. But then there's his fiancée, Clara Middleton, who starts to see the cracks. She realizes he's a total narcissist. He doesn't love her. He just wants to own her. The whole book is this tense story of her trying to break free from this suffocating ego. And Clara's struggle leads us to another thing that made Meredith so incredibly modern. His female characters. Clara wasn't a one-off. Meredith made a habit of writing women who were smart, independent, and just refused to sit back and be decorations in a man's story. And you have to remember the time period here. Most female characters were just the wife, the mother, the girl who needed saving. Meredith gave his women agency. He gave them rich, complicated inner worlds and made them the heroes of their own stories, fighting for their own liberation. I mean, just look at Diana Warwick from Diana of the Crossways. She was actually based on a real person, a famous socialite. And her story is a roller coaster. We're talking a failed marriage, navigating shady political deals, being at the center of a public scandal. And through it all, she's calling out the ridiculous double standards for men and women. For a character written in the 19th century, just amazing. Okay, so when you put all of this together, the psychology, the social satire, the strong women, what do you get? What's Meredith's lasting legacy? Why should we still care about these sometimes, let's be honest, pretty dense novels? Well, this little summary says it all. You've got Richard Feverel warning us about suppressing who we are, The Egoist calling out selfishness, Modern Love showing the painful truth of a breakup, and Diana of the Crossways telling the story of a woman's fight for freedom. Every single one of these themes, they feel like they could have been written yesterday. So let's go back to that first question. What made him so ahead of his time? Simple. George Meredith was basically writing the blueprint for the modern novel while the Victorian era was still going on. That deep dive into psychology, that biting social commentary, and especially those complex, independent women, he was breaking new ground that would inspire writers for decades. And I'll just leave you with this one last thing to chew on. Remember, Meredith's most famous book is about a guy obsessed with his own perfect public image. So, in our age of social media, personal branding, and carefully crafted online lives, you have to wonder, right? Is his critique of egoism more relevant now than it ever was? Just something to think about. Thanks for joining. Hey, welcome. Today we are diving deep into the world of Charles Kingsley, a really fascinating Victorian writer who believed that words, well, Words were weapons. He didn't just sit down to write entertaining stories, he was writing manifestos. He used novels to fight for social justice and, at the very same time, to build this larger-than-life, heroic vision for his entire nation. So, that brings us to the central puzzle of Charles Kingsley. I mean, how does that even work? This was a man of some pretty intense contradictions. On one hand, you have a passionate reformer fighting tooth and nail against things like child labor. But on the other, you've got this fervent patriot who's cheering on England's growing empire. How did one person manage to be both? Well, let's get into it. All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the man himself and what drove him. Then, we'll see how he gave a voice to the voiceless with his protest novels. After that, we'll explore his other side as England's epic storyteller. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the complicated legacy he left behind. To really get a handle on Kingsley's work, we have to start with his core motivation. You see, everything he wrote, and I mean everything, from children's fantasies to sweeping historical epics, it was all powered by one single, really powerful idea. I mean, just look at this list. Kingsley was a true Victorian powerhouse. He wasn't just a novelist, he was a respected historian, a clergyman in the Church of England, a super passionate social reformer, and even a keen naturalist. Every single one of these roles fed into his writing, giving it this unique blend of moral purpose and incredible depth. So the idea that tied all of this together was something called Christian socialism. Now, don't get too hung up on the political sound of that. For Kingsley, this wasn't really about politics as we think of it. It was way simpler. It was about taking the basic Christian principles, compassion, fairness, looking out for your neighbor, and applying them to solve the brutal, real-world problems of industrial England. And that mission, that core belief, led him directly to his first major novels. This is where he really weaponized his fiction, using it to shine a massive spotlight on the suffering of the working class and expose the injustices they were facing day in and day out. A perfect example is his novel Alton Locke. This book just throws you right into the grim reality of a working-class tailor who gets swept up in the Chartist movement. And this was a real thing. It was a huge grassroots campaign fighting for basic rights for workers. The book was a raw, unflinching look at just how brutal life could be. Yep, and that's exactly how people saw it. It was considered a powerful critique. This wasn't just some story to pass the time. No way. It was a political statement. It was an attack on a system that Kingsley believed was just fundamentally unfair and, from his perspective, unchristian. But here's where Kingsley gets really clever. He could also be much more subtle. He's probably most famous for The Water Babies. Now, on the surface, it's this utterly charming children's fantasy about a little chimney sweep named Tom who has this magical adventure. But hidden just beneath that fairy tale surface is a blistering critique of one of the worst evils of his time, child labor. And when you put these two books side by side, it really shows you Kingsley's incredible range. With Alton Locke, he's using gritty, in-your-face realism to get his message across to adults. But with The Water Babies, he uses a magical moral fable to deliver a similar message to a completely different audience, kids and their parents. Two totally different approaches, but both driven by the exact same moral mission. Okay, so Kingsley wasn't just a critic of England's problems. That's only half the picture. He was also one of its greatest champions. He became this master storyteller who helped shape the whole Victorian idea of what it even meant to be English. You can see this perfectly in his most popular novel, Westward Ho. This thing is a full-on, swashbuckling historical adventure set back in the Elizabethan era. We're talking thrilling tales of brave sea captains, epic naval battles against the Spanish Armada. It's just a roaring celebration of English courage, Protestant faith, and, imperial ambition. And his historical range was just staggering. I mean, look at this. He wasn't just stuck in one period. He jumps back to the 16th century for Westward Ho, then all the way to the 11th century to tell the story of an English hero fighting the Norman invaders, and then clear back to 5th century Alexandria to explore this massive clash between ancient philosophy and early Christianity. For Kingsley, all of history was just part of England's grand story. And across all these historical adventures, you start to see these common threads emerge. They're all stories about patriotism, about trying to define Englishness. They celebrate heroism, duty, and loyalty. And they're fascinated by these huge clashes of culture and faith that, in Kingsley's mind, were the very things that forged the English nation. So, what do we do with a writer this complex today? How do we reconcile the guy fighting for social justice with the guy building national myths? Well, it all comes back to his fundamental belief in the power of the pen. Kingsley really leaves behind this dual legacy. On one side, he was absolutely a social crusader, using his novels as a megaphone to fight for the marginalized. But at the same time, he was a national storyteller, crafting the heroic myths his country was eager to believe about itself. He was even a bit of a pioneer, subtly weaving Darwin's brand new ideas about evolution into a children's fantasy story. So here's the bottom line, the most important takeaway from all of this. Charles Kingsley's ultimate contribution was showing the world just how powerful literature could be. He proved that a novel could be so much more than just a story. In his hands, a novel became a sermon on morality, a political pamphlet demanding change, and a history lesson defining a nation's soul, all wrapped up in one. And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. Kingsley used the most powerful medium of his day, the novel, to campaign for what he believed in. So what about us? In our world today, what do you think is the most powerful medium for activism? What has the power to really challenge, inspire, and shape our world? Thanks for joining me. What if I told you that one of literature's most famous authors is also one of its most misunderstood? Yeah, we all know Artie Blackmore for one book, and one book only, the legendary romance Lorna Doone. But today, we're going to pull back the curtain and unpack the hidden story of the author behind that masterpiece. So what's the secret formula, right? What is it that makes a story stick around for over 150 years, captivating generation after generation? Is it just a great plot, or is there something more going on? Well, we're about to find out by taking a deep dive into one of the most enduring classics of all time. All right, first up, we have to talk about the legend itself, Lorna Doone. This is the book that made Artie Blackmore a household name. It became this literary giant that honestly cast a shadow over everything else he would ever write. And when you look at what's inside, you can totally see why. At its heart, this story is just epic. It's this raw, powerful tale of forbidden love between these warring families, a desperate quest for revenge, and it's all set against the wild, windswept moors of 17th century England. It is pure drama. Okay, think of it like this, like a recipe for a classic novel. You start with this really powerful conflict. A heroic farmer, John Ridd, he vows revenge on the outlaw Doone clan because they murdered his father. The secret ingredient? The rugged, untamed landscape of Exmoor, which is basically a character in its own right. Then you stir in a star-crossed romance. John falls for Lorna, a Doone. Can you believe it? You ground the whole thing in real historical events, add a dash of kidnapping and intrigue, and bam, you've got a perfect storm of storytelling. So who was the mind behind this epic, right? It's time to meet the man himself, R.D. Blackmore. Was he really just the author of one famous romance, or was there a lot more to his story? Richard Doddridge Blackmore, he was a quintessential Victorian novelist, but his style was totally unique. His writing is really defined by three powerful things: this deep, almost spiritual connection to the English countryside, prose that honestly feels like poetry, and characters so rich and detailed they feel like people you could actually know. And that right there, that is the absolute key to understanding his genius. His real legacy isn't just about telling stories set in the countryside. It's his incredible ability to transport you there. He doesn't just describe a landscape, he captures its very soul, both the beauty and the brutality of rural life. But here's the twist. This is where it gets really interesting. While the world knows him for Lorna Doone and the moors of Exmoor, that's just one tiny corner of his literary universe. It's time to see what else is out there. Just look at this range. Years before Lorna Doone even came out, he was writing these gritty sensation mysteries like Clara Vaughan, which is all about a daughter hunting for her father's killer. Then he just jumps over to historical fiction with Springhaven, a spy thriller set during the Napoleonic Wars. And then he writes Erema, this epic adventure that takes its heroine all the way from the English countryside to the American frontier. This guy was definitely not a one-trick pony. And when you start looking at these other books, a really surprising pattern emerges. Way ahead of his time, Blackmore was consistently writing these strong, determined heroines. Women like Clara Vaughan and Erema. They aren't just sitting around waiting to be rescued. No way. They are the driving force of their own stories. They're detectives and adventurers seeking justice on their own terms. It just proves that the famous romance author was also a surprisingly progressive writer. So this brings us to the final and most crucial question. What is R.D. Blackmore's true legacy? Is he simply the Lorna Doone guy, or does he deserve to be remembered for something more? Well, on one hand, you've got the image we all know, the sweeping epic romance of Lorna Doone. But on the other, when you look closer, you see his real, lasting impact. It's in his masterful creation of these atmospheric landscapes, not just in Exmoor, but everywhere he wrote about. It's in his consistent portrayal of strong, independent women. And it's in his incredible skill at weaving history and adventure into these thrilling, complex plots. That's the full picture. Ultimately, he wasn't just the author of one book. We're talking about over 15 novels. He was constantly experimenting with different genres and characters. He was a versatile and prolific author, just hidden in the massive shadow of his own greatest success. So now that we know the truth, there's really only one question left, isn't there? We've uncovered this whole literary universe that most people don't even know exists, filled with murder mysteries, spy thrillers, and globe-trotting adventures. All these worlds are just sitting there waiting to be rediscovered. The only question is, which of Blackmore's lost worlds will... You know, we usually think of authors as having one clear voice, one style. But today, we're diving into a Victorian writer who had two completely different, almost contradictory voices, all packed into one amazing career. So think about this for a second. On one hand, you've got the grimy, smoke-filled factories and the brutal poverty of 19th century England. And on the other, you have these picture-perfect little towns where the biggest drama is who's coming for tea. I mean, they honestly feel like they're from two totally different planets. Well, it turns out they're not. Both of these worlds were brought to life by one incredible author. Her name was Elizabeth Gaskell, and because she was a minister's wife living right in the middle of industrial Manchester, she had this unique view into both the fancy drawing rooms of the rich and the really tough lives of the poor. And that's the whole thing about Elizabeth Gaskell's work, this incredible duality. On one side, she was a fierce social crusader. She wasn't afraid to write about the toughest subjects, like poverty, class warfare, and the way society treated women. But then, there's this completely other side to her, a gentle, witty observer who wrote these hilarious and heartwarming stories about life in a small town. Okay, so to really get a handle on her, let's start with her as the novelist of social justice. This is where she really burst onto the scene and, honestly, where she ruffled the most feathers. Now, Gaskell was a huge part of this literary movement called social realism, and the goal was pretty straightforward. It wasn't about escapism. It was about holding a mirror up to society and making the comfortable, well-off readers see what life was really like for the working poor, and to feel some real empathy for them. And wow, did she come out swinging. Her very first novel, Mary Barton, was like a literary bombshell. It's set in Manchester, the absolute heart of the Industrial Revolution, and it does not pull any punches when it comes to showing the grim, harsh reality of factory life. Yeah, Mary Barton was way more than just a story. It was a powerful accusation. It exposed this massive, uncrossable divide between the rich mill owners and their starving workers. It basically forced people to think about the human suffering that went into making all the cheap goods they were buying. So, if Mary Barton was a shock, her next big social novel, Ruth, was a full-blown scandal. See, in Victorian England, an unmarried mother, a so-called fallen woman, was a complete outcast. She was seen as ruined. And what does Gaskell do? She makes one the hero of her next book. Her whole point was to take a direct shot at the moral hypocrisy of the time. The novel makes this passionate case for compassion and forgiveness, showing its main character not as a sinner, but as a victim who deserves a second chance. For 1853, that was an unbelievably brave thing to do. But the book that really ties all of these social concerns together, and the one she's probably most famous for today, is North and South. It's this epic story about conflict, culture clash, and of course, romance. At the very heart of the novel is this amazing contrast. You've got Margaret Hale, who comes from the quiet, traditional, agricultural south of England. She gets uprooted and moves to the gritty, fast-paced, industrial north. And there, she immediately clashes with John Thornton, this tough, no-nonsense factory owner. They basically are these two different worlds colliding in human form. And their story is the backdrop for all the biggest conflicts of the time. You know, new industry versus old traditions, the bitter strikes between workers and bosses, and a main character, Margaret, who's way more independent and outspoken than women were supposed to be. It's a huge social epic, all wrapped up in a really compelling and complicated love story. Okay, but just when everybody thought they had her figured out as this serious, grim social writer, Gaskell completely changed gears and showed everyone this other side of her genius, as this incredibly sharp, funny observer of small-town life. And get this, the same year she published that super controversial novel Ruth, she also published Cranford, and you couldn't find two more different books. Cranford is warm, it's funny, it's just completely charming, and it's still one of our most popular books today. The world of Cranford is just such a delight. It's this little town run almost entirely by women, and the biggest crises are things like a cat swallowing a piece of expensive lace. It's written as a series of light, funny stories, but Gaskell is too smart for it to be just fluff. If you look closely, underneath all that charm, she's still exploring really interesting ideas about class, money, and what life was like for these women. So, you've got the fierce social reformer on one hand and the witty village observer on the other. How do you even square that? Well, her legacy is so powerful because she refused to be just one thing. Her range was just astounding. I mean, besides what we've talked about, she wrote a dark, tragic, historical novel called Sylvia's Lovers. She wrote the definitive, super personal biography of her good friend, Charlotte Bronte. And her last novel, which she never got to finish, Wives and Daughters, is widely seen as this absolute masterpiece of character and social observation. And here's the key to it all. It didn't matter if she was writing about a violent factory strike or a silly tea party. Gaskell had this incredible gift for weaving in really sharp social commentary into stories that were just, first and foremost, incredibly human and impossible to put down. So in the end, she wasn't the social crusader or the gentle observer. She was both. She just got it. She understood that life is made of huge injustices and tiny funny moments. It's both tragic and warm. And her real genius was that she could see and write about all of it. Which kind of leaves us with one last question to think about. In our world today, which version of Gaskell do we need more? The one who wasn't afraid to call out inequality, or the one who celebrated the small, everyday connections that hold us all together? You know, maybe the answer is that, just like back then, we desperately need both. So when you think of Victorian literature, what pops into your head? Probably stuffy drawing rooms, super strict social rules, right? Well, today we're going to pull back that lace curtain and introduce you to some of the era's biggest troublemakers. Let's dive in. Look, we all know the big names, but this explainer is all about the writers who were really pushing the envelope. We're going to meet two authors who challenged the very foundations of their society. One did it through some seriously fearless social commentary, and the other, well, he was busy building entirely new worlds for us to get lost in. First up, we have Anne Bronte. Now, you've definitely heard of the Bronte sisters, but Anne was often seen as the quiet one, kind of living in the shadow of Charlotte and Emily. But here's the thing. In reality, her work was maybe the most radical of them all. This quote right here, it's describing Helen Graham, the hero of Anne's novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and it just perfectly captures the heart of her rebellion. Helen isn't some damsel in distress waiting for a hero. Nope. She takes charge of her own life, which, let me tell you, was a truly revolutionary idea back then. That's right, a book from 1848 is now considered one of the very first feminist novels. So, what on earth made it so shocking and so important? I mean, just look at this list. The sheer audacity to write about these things in the 1840s is incredible. Bronte didn't just hint at them, she put them right out there front and center. Her main character, Helen, literally slams the door on her abusive alcoholic husband to save herself and her son. In a time when married women had basically zero legal rights, this was like setting off a bomb. And yeah, as you can probably guess, it caused a massive scandal. Critics were appalled by its coarse and brutal honesty about a bad marriage. But that backlash is exactly what proves how rebellious she was. Today, we don't see that as a flaw. We see it as her greatest strength. Okay, let's pivot to our second rebel, a totally different but just as influential figure, Edward Bulwer-Lytton. So if Bronte rebelled against social conventions, Bulwer-Lytton rebelled against literary ones. He was a true architect of fiction as we know it. Sound familiar? Of course it does. This iconic opening line, which gets parodied all the time, was actually written by Bulwer-Lytton for his 1830 novel, Paul Clifford. But believe me, his impact goes way, way beyond one famous phrase. So check this out. He made a criminal the hero. By making Paul Clifford a character you could actually root for, someone pushed into crime by a totally unfair society, Bulwer Lytton turned the crime story into a sharp critique of the whole legal system.
He was also a master of the historical novel. The Last Days of Pompeii wasn't just some adventure. It was a vivid, painstakingly researched deep dive into Roman life. He perfectly blended historical facts with page-turning drama and pretty much set the template for the genre.
And just when you think you've got him pegged, he goes and helps pioneer science fiction. We're talking years before H.G. Wells. Bulwer Lytton was already exploring things like utopian societies, futuristic tech, and the dangers of ultimate power. The Coming Race was a huge influence on early sci-fi. This timeline just says it all, doesn't it? The range is just staggering. From social satire to psychological thrillers, from mystical stories to sci-fi, this guy's career was all about innovation. He absolutely refused to be put in a box.
So, what do we have? Two very different writers, the sharp social critic and the prolific genre hopper. So what's the common thread? Well, let's take a look at how their rebellious legacies have evolved.
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. Anne Bronte, who was once written off for being too scandalous, is now praised for that very reason. And Edward Bulwer Lytton, who was a superstar in his day but later called melodramatic, is now seen as the guy who built the foundations for the books we love. History basically flipped the script on both of them. So, what's the bottom line here? Anne Bronte's fight for a woman's right to choose her own path is still incredibly inspiring today. And every single time you pick up a detective novel or a sci-fi epic, you're walking in the footsteps of Edward Bulwer Lytton. Together, they completely shatter that stuffy, one-dimensional image of the Victorian age. And that kind of leaves us with one final big question. Their stories prove that reputations change and that it can take time to see the true impact of a rebellious voice. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who are the quiet rebels and the unfashionable architects writing today whose work will end up defining our era for generations to come?
When you hear the name Bronte, what comes to mind? Probably windswept moors, maybe some gothic romance, and definitely passionate, brooding heroes, right? Names like Charlotte and Emily, who gave us Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, are absolute titans of English literature. But today, we're going to dive into the story of the other Bronte sister. All right, so let's get right into it, because while Charlotte and Emily were writing about all that intense passion and the supernatural, it was the youngest sister, Anne, who wrote novels that were, well, they were social dynamite. So shockingly realistic, they could be considered some of the very first truly feminist works in history. No joke. So meet Anne Bronte. She lived from 1820 to 1849, and yeah, she's often called the forgotten sister. I mean, it's gotta be tough when your siblings are Charlotte and Emily, right? Their legacies are just massive. But here's the thing, if you overlook Anne, you are missing out on a voice of incredible courage and just crystal clarity. She was on a completely different path. And this contrast between them, it is absolutely key. Think about it. Her sisters were exploring those wild, emotional landscapes inside the human heart. Anne, though, she turned her gaze outward, straight at the harsh, gritty social realities of her time. Her writing wasn't about some romantic escapism. It was a mirror, and she held it right up to the injustices of Victorian society, especially when it came to women. Anne's work is really defined by this quiet, yet incredibly powerful realism. She didn't dance around the issues. She tackled them head on. We're talking about deep-seated gender inequality, social injustice, and the absolutely suffocating constraints of marriage for women back in the 19th century. Believe me, she wasn't just telling stories. She was making a statement. Now, she only published 2 major novels in her short life, but each one acts as this powerful critique of the world she knew. You've got Agnes Grey, which explores the brutal life of a governess, and then there's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which presents this totally radical vision of a woman's independence. So let's break them both down. First up, Agnes Grey. And you have to understand, this wasn't just fiction. The novel is semi-autobiographical, drawing heavily from Anne's own really, really difficult experiences working as a governess. She basically stripped away any romantic notions about the job and exposed it for what it truly was. To really get the impact of this novel, you have to understand the role of a governess back then. It was this strange social limbo. You're more educated than the servants, but you are absolutely not a member of the family. This created a life of profound isolation and left these women incredibly vulnerable, totally at the whim of their employers. Through her character, Agnes, Anne paints this devastatingly clear picture. We see constant mistreatment and disrespect. Agnes is forced to watch her young students torture small animals, totally powerless to intervene. You can feel that profound isolation and loneliness of living in a house where you were trapped by rigid class structures, belonging neither with the family nor with the staff. Anne exposes the deep emotional and psychological toll this takes, all in a world where a woman's choices were so limited, and her entire worth was measured only by her prospects for marriage. So, let's move to her second novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. If Agnes Grey was a quiet critique, this novel was a full-throated roar. It's her masterpiece, and for its time, it was an incredibly radical act of literary rebellion. And that's not just a modern take, by the way. People recognized this book was explosive from the very beginning. It boldly confronted themes that Victorian society preferred to keep locked up and hidden behind closed doors. So what exactly made it so revolutionary? Well, the protagonist, Helen Graham, is trapped in a terrible marriage with an abusive alcoholic husband. But instead of quietly submitting like society demanded, she completely defies convention. She flees with her young son to protect him from his father's destructive influence. And then, in a move that was truly radical, she supports herself as a professional artist, asserting not just her social, but her financial independence. She effectively slams the door on her marriage and claims her right to her own life. You really cannot overstate how shocking this was. This was 1848. Women were legally the property of their husbands. So a novel where a woman just up and leaves her husband, and she's portrayed as the hero for doing it, that was absolutely revolutionary. It was a direct challenge to the entire patriarchal structure of the era. So despite being overshadowed for so long, Anne's legacy is profound and it's enduring. Her voice, once forgotten, is now recognized for its quiet strength and its moral courage. And you know what? It still matters today, maybe more than ever. Anne Bronte was a true pioneer, plain and simple. She used realism as a tool for sharp social criticism, advocating for the rights and dignity of women long before it was fashionable. Her work really did lay the groundwork for so much feminist literature to come, championing the idea that a woman's worth is not defined by her husband or her social status, but by her own moral integrity and resilience. Anne's story really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Her voice was nearly lost, just dismissed in favor of her more famous siblings. It leaves us with a powerful question. How many other radical, groundbreaking voices from the past have been silenced or just overlooked and are just out there, waiting for us to finally start listening? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tearing into one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, wildest novels ever written, Emily Bronte's timeless and tumultuous masterpiece, Wuthering Heights. Right, let's just dive straight into this Gothic classic. I mean, how does a novel that's over 175 years old, a story of obsessive love and brutal revenge, still feel so incredibly raw and haunting today? Well, we're going to figure that out. And to do that, we have to start at the novel's dark, beating heart, a passionate relationship that's so powerful it's almost transcendent, but also so intense it burns everything and everyone to the ground. So, first thing you need to know, this is not your typical romance. The connection between Catherine and Heathcliff, it was forged out on those bleak, wild Yorkshire moors. It's elemental, a bond so deep it defines their entire lives. For better, and as we're about to see, for much, much worse. And then comes the moment. The one choice that just breaks everything. Catherine decides to marry Edgar Linton, and it sets off this catastrophic chain reaction. And her choice, well, it isn't really about love. It's a calculated move for social status, for the security he can give her. This really boils it all down, doesn't it? This isn't just a simple love triangle. It's a full-on clash between two completely different worlds. On one side, you have Heathcliff. He is primal, untamed emotion. You know, he's the guy she famously says is more myself than I am. And on the other side, Edgar Linton, who represents safety, society, and everything that's proper. So what happens when she makes that choice? What does that one decision unleash? Well, it doesn't just break a heart. Oh no, it ignites a firestorm of revenge that's going to consume everyone it touches, not just for a little while, but across generations. For Heathcliff, this is the ultimate betrayal. And his pain, his despair, it doesn't just fade away. It transforms, it twists and curdles into something so much more dangerous. This is one of the most amazing things about the book, watching how the most passionate love can morph into this destructive, all-consuming force. And here's the crucial part. Heathcliff's revenge isn't some impulsive, heat-of-the-moment thing. It is a cold, methodical, and absolutely ruthless plan that he carries out over years. He doesn't just go after the people who wronged him. He targets their children too, making sure this vicious cycle goes on and on. Okay, to really get these characters and why they're so raw, you have to understand where they live. Because in Wuthering Heights, the setting is not just a backdrop. It's a living, breathing character that shapes every single person in the story. I mean, just picture it. These wild, rugged, totally isolated moors. The landscape itself is basically a mirror of what's going on inside the characters. The weather can whip from calm to a violent storm in an instant, and honestly, so can their passions. It's the perfect reflection of the primal instincts driving this whole story. And the novel's central conflict is just perfectly captured in its two main houses. You've got Wuthering Heights, which is raw and stormy and untamed, just like Heathcliff. And then you have Thrushcross Grange, all civilized, refined, and a little bit constrained, just like the Lintons. These two places are symbols for that constant war between wild passion and buttoned-up society. As if all that wasn't intense enough, Bronte then throws in ghosts and all these supernatural elements. But Catherine's ghost, for instance, isn't just there for a cheap scare. No, it's there to show us that this unresolved passion, this inescapable past, it literally haunts the living, blurring the lines between life and death. Now, for me, the true genius of this novel isn't just in what it says, but in how it says it. Bronte uses this really innovative and complex structure that was so ahead of its time. It basically forces you, the reader, to become a detective. It's structured as something called a frame narrative. It's kind of like those Russian nesting dolls. We don't get the story directly. Instead, we hear it from a narrator who's hearing it from someone else. This was revolutionary because it challenges you. You have to actively piece the story together from these different and often really biased perspectives, and you're never quite sure who you can trust. So we get the story through two main filters. First, there's this guy, Mr. Lockwood, a total outsider who stumbles into this hornet's nest and has no idea what's going on. Then he gets the main story from Nellie Dean, the housekeeper. Now, she's an insider, she knows everything, but her story is totally shaped by her own judgments and opinions. It creates this brilliant ambiguity where you're constantly questioning what's really true. So, after all the darkness, all the revenge, all the turmoil, why are we still talking about this incredibly complex story almost 2 centuries later? What is it about this book that makes it stick? You gotta understand, when Wuthering Heights came out, it was a bombshell. It completely shattered the traditional Victorian ideas of what a polite romance or a moral story should be. It dared to explore the darker, obsessive parts of being human with this shocking honesty. It's no wonder it paved the way for so many other writers and has been adapted into pretty much everything you can think of. And this is why it still matters. This isn't just some dusty book from history class. The core themes, they're absolutely timeless. Obsession, revenge, social class, the devastating consequences of emotions running wild. I mean, these are all things we're still grappling with today in our own lives. Ultimately, I think Wuthering Heights is so enduring because it refuses to give you easy answers. There are no clear heroes or villains. It just forces you to look at the most intense, primal, and often uncomfortable parts of being human. That terrifying place where love, hate, and revenge all get tangled up until you can't tell them apart anymore. And that leaves us with one final huge question, the one at the very heart of this unforgettable novel. Is a love, this all-consuming, a transcendent spiritual force that can even defy death, or is it just a terrifying engine of pure destruction? The most brilliant and maybe frustrating part is the book never really decides. It leaves that for you to ponder long after you've turned the final page. All right, let's dive in. Today, we're talking about a writer who didn't just write novels, she completely changed the game for English fiction. I'm talking about Charlotte Bronte. She was way more than just a novelist. She was a true pioneer whose voice took on an entire era. So what exactly made her work so revolutionary? Let's get into it. And this quote right here, it absolutely nails it. A cornerstone of feminist literature. And for very good reason. Bronte's writing is all about that deep dive into the inner lives of women. You know, their complex emotions, their struggles, and their powerful desire for independence. She is the novel not just to tell a story, but as a serious tool to critique the world she was living in. And there is no better place to start than with her most famous novel, Jane Eyre. When this was published back in 1847, she actually used a male pseudonym, Currer Bell. And this wasn't just another book on the shelf. It was this groundbreaking story about one woman's defiant fight for her own identity. So the story kicks off with Jane as an orphan, and she's suffering under the incredibly cruel hand of her aunt, Mrs. Reed. But right from the get-go, Bronte makes one thing crystal clear. Jane is not a victim. She's a resilient soul, totally determined to overcome this oppressive world she was born into. And you can really see that journey laid out here. Jane's path to becoming her own person is just this series of incredible trials. First, she somehow survives an abusive childhood. Then she endures the grim, harsh Lowood institution. And finally, she gets a little taste of freedom as a governess at a place called Thornfield Hall. It's right here that the stage is set for her ultimate fight for both personal and moral independence. So at Thornfield, this story just ignites. Jane meets her employer, the super mysterious and intense Mr. Rochester. And what starts to unfold is one of literature's most famous and, let's be real, complicated romances. It's a relationship that just completely challenges the rigid class and gender rules of Victorian England. But of course, just when Jane gets a shot at happiness, a massive secret is revealed. Rochester is already married. His wife, Bertha Mason, is literally hidden away in the attic. This is the absolute turning point. Jane is forced into this impossible choice, right? Does she follow her heart and stay with the man she loves, or does she honor her own integrity and her self-respect and leave? Jane's choice, and really the entire novel, was just so revolutionary for so many reasons. For one, by writing in the first person, Bronte gives us this intimate, unfiltered access to a woman's mind. It's like we're right there with her. She directly attacks those restrictive gender roles, giving Jane that immoral line, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me." Talk about a cry for freedom that still gives you chills. The book basically argues that a woman has the right to both love and her own autonomy, which was a huge critique of the entire social structure. But Bronte was just getting started. Her social commentary did not stop with Jane Eyre. Her other major works kept exploring these same vital themes: class, gender, and just how complex the human mind is, each in their own unique way. Okay, so in her second novel, Shirley, Bronte kind of zooms out and tackles the massive social upheaval of the Industrial Revolution. She uses this really turbulent time as a backdrop to look at how these huge economic changes were reshaping women's lives and their place in the world, and often not for the better. Now, what's so clever here is how Bronte uses two different heroines to make her point. On one hand, you've got Shirley Keeldar. She's wealthy, fiercely independent, and she represents a whole new, empowered path for women. And then on the other hand, you have Carolyn Helstone, who really embodies all the constraints that Victorian society placed on women of her class. This isn't just a story, it's like a debate happening right on the page about the future of womanhood itself. Now, Bronte's final novel, published in her lifetime, Villette, is maybe her most profound and modern. It follows the main character, Lucy Snow, as she moves to this fictional European town. But the real journey here isn't about geography. Nope. It's a deep and often pretty painful exploration of Lucy's inner world, her loneliness, her repressed desires, and her desperate search for meaning in a world that just seems totally indifferent to her. And Villette is an absolute masterclass in what we call the psychological novel. So what does that mean? Well, it means the story is focused almost entirely on what's going on inside a character's head, their thoughts, their emotional turmoil, their mental landscape. At a time when novels were all about external plot, Bronte turned inward, using things like dreams and even unreliable narration to capture Lucy's psyche with a depth that was just way, way ahead of its time. So when you step back and look at all of her work, what is Charlotte Bronte's ultimate legacy? Well, it's not just one novel or one character. It's a fundamental shift in what a novel could even do. I mean, her contributions are just immense. She created these female main characters who were strong, independent, and felt psychologically real. She used the novel as a scalpel for sharp social criticism. She blended this dark, gothic atmosphere with raw emotional intensity. And really, she just paved the way for countless writers who came after her. And it's pretty wild to see how quickly all of this happened. Jane Eyre was an instant sensation in 1847. Shirley followed just 2 years later, tackling those big social issues head on. Then, Villette, her most introspective work, came out in 1853. And The Professor, which was actually the first novel she ever wrote, was finally published after her death, giving us this incredible glimpse into the very beginning of her journey. And that really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? Bronte gave a voice to women who were fighting for their own identity in a world that was actively trying to silence them. So now, over 175 years later, her work kind of forces us to ask ourselves, what are the... Okay, so picture this, a writer from the 1800s, but he's writing about stuff that sounds like it's ripped straight from today's headlines. We're talking financial scams, political hypocrisy, that whole desperate hustle to make it. His writing is so sharp, it's almost spooky. Today, we're diving into the work of a true master of social commentary, Anthony Trollope. But wait, how is that even possible? I mean, how can these novels, packed with old-school clergymen and country gentlemen, hit so close to home in our world of social media, crazy politics, and nonstop financial stress? Well, the answer is pretty simple, actually. Trollope wasn't just writing about his own time. He was digging deep into the messy, unchanging core of what makes us human. So, to really get his writing, you gotta get the man himself. See, Trollope wasn't some hermit, locked away in an attic. Nope, he had a day job. He was a post office official, and that job sent him all over the country. He was constantly observing, taking it all in, from the quiet dramas of small town life to the chaotic and, yeah, often corrupt heart of London. And this guy wrote a lot. I mean, he was incredibly prolific. He made it his whole mission to explore the lives of the English upper and middle classes. But what makes his writing so good is this mix of realism, humor, and a real understanding of moral complexity. He never just gave you characters who were all good or all bad. No, he built these entire social worlds on the page where you understood that everyone, and I mean everyone, had their own reasons for what they did. And the most famous of these worlds has to be his fictional county, Barsetshire. But listen, this wasn't just some boring backdrop for his stories. It was a living, breathing place that he kept coming back to, almost like a laboratory where he could dissect all the pressures and politics of English life. This set of novels, The Chronicles of Barsetshire, is really his masterpiece of social observation. The best way to think about it, it's kind of like a prestige, long-running TV show. You follow the same characters, the same families across 6 different books. And because of that, Trollope builds this massive, immersive world where you can see how all the small-town drama actually reflects the biggest issues of the era. Right at the heart of this world is the Church of England. But here's the clever part. Trollope is really using the church as a stand-in for any powerful institution. You read a book like Barchester Towers, and you realize the power struggles aren't really about faith. They're about ambition, control, and pure hypocrisy. And he creates these incredible characters, like the absolutely terrifying Mrs. Proudie, who is just the perfect symbol of that raw hunger for power. And bubbling under the surface of everything, the rigid, unforgiving class system. Trollope just tears this social hierarchy apart. His characters are always wrestling with money problems, with that burning desire to climb the social ladder. And of course, that timeless question, do you marry for love or for status? That's the huge question at the center of novels like Dr. Thorne. And this brings us to one of Trollope's favorite themes, tradition versus reform. In The Warden, which is the very first book in the series, we meet this gentle clergyman, Septimus Harding. Suddenly, he finds himself smack in the middle of a huge public scandal, totally caught between a comfortable old tradition and this new push for social justice. It's just a fascinating look at how good people try to do the right thing when there are no easy answers. But here's the thing, just when you think you've got Trollope pegged as this master of quiet country life, he completely flips the script. He yanks us out of the gentle world of Barsetshire with all its small moral dilemmas and throws us into the total moral rot of London. The whole mood just changes. It goes from gentle observation to sharp, angry satire. And that pivot brings us to what a lot of people think is his absolute masterpiece. It's the main reason he feels so incredibly modern. We're talking about the novel The Way We Live Now. It came out in 1875, and let me tell you, it is a massive, cynical, and just brutal takedown of a society that is completely rotting from the inside. And you have to understand, satire isn't just jokes. It's a weapon. It's when literature holds up this kind of funhouse mirror to society to show it how ugly it's become. And in The Way We Live Now, oh man, Trollope does not hold back. He's done just observing. Now he's here to pass judgment. So who's at the dark heart of this story? This guy, Augustus Melmotte. He's this mysterious, super successful finance bro who just shows up in London, and everyone's heard he's ridiculously rich. But he's a total fraud, a charismatic con artist playing a high-stakes game. He basically becomes the poster boy for his era's worship of money over everything else. He's the classic blueprint for corporate greed. Does any of that sound familiar? Financial bubbles that are all hype? A culture where what's right takes a backseat to what's rich? That desperate climb for status? I mean, Trollope was writing about a sketchy railway stock deal, but he could have just as easily been writing about a crypto crash or some huge Ponzi scheme. He just saw it so clearly, how that kind of unchecked greed doesn't just ruin people, it poisons an entire society. But his focus wasn't always on the big picture of society. Trollope could also zoom way, way in. He could become this incredible psychological novelist, diving into the darkest corners of a single person's mind with so much detail and nuance. Take his novel, He Knew He Was Right. It is a gut-wrenching deep dive into how destructive jealousy can be. The story tracks this husband as he falls into this insane obsession that just obliterates his marriage and his entire life. It's a really powerful look at how quickly suspicion can just poison trust, and it really shows you how well Trollope understood our deepest, darkest insecurities. So, okay, when you put it all together, you've got the social drama of Barthshire, the savage satire of London, and these intense psychological studies. Yeah, you really start to see why Trollope's work has stuck around for so long. And that's really why Trollope is still a must-read today. His observations about society are still razor sharp. His characters feel like actual people you could know, struggling with problems that never go away. And his work really is just a giant mirror held up to human nature. You know, our ambitions, our screw-ups, our ability to be both good and awful. He built these worlds that aren't just insightful, they're genuinely entertaining. Which, leaves us with one last, really interesting question to chew on. If Trollope were alive right now, holding up that same satirical mirror, what would he see? What would he write about? Social media influencers, the 24/7 news cycle, the wild world of global finance? His whole genius was spotting the patterns in how we behave, and you can bet he'd find plenty to write about in the way we live now. Okay, so what if a book could be more than just a story? What if it could be a weapon? Today, we're diving into the life of a Victorian writer who truly believed that. He used his novels to fight the biggest injustices of his day. Let's get into it and meet this incredible figure, Charles Reade, the crusader with a pen. But first, let's start with a really big question, one that was at the absolute heart of everything Reade did. Could a novel, a piece of fiction, actually change the law? Could a story pack such a punch that it forces an entire society to fix itself? Just keep that question in the back of your mind as we go. So to find the answer to that question, we first need to meet the man who made this his life's mission. Right, this is Charles Reade. He was writing right in the middle of the Victorian era. Now, this was a time of amazing progress for sure, but also some really deep systemic problems. For a lot of writers back then, a novel was a form of escape. But for Reade, it was the exact opposite. He thought a writer's job wasn't just to entertain, but to fight. For him, a novel wasn't an escape, it was a weapon. Reade was a pioneer of this really powerful genre, social reform fiction. And the core idea is kind of genius, right? You embed a super sharp critique of society inside a story that people can't put down. This was a radical idea. Instead of some dry, boring government report that maybe a handful of people would read, you get this dramatic, emotional story that grabs the public by the collar and makes you feel the injustice. It forces a conversation that people just can't ignore. So, that's the theory. But how did he actually do it? Let's take a look at how Reade turned his fiction into a real, genuine force for social change. One of his biggest targets was the absolutely horrifying state of mental asylums in Victorian England. I mean, these were places of unbelievable suffering, totally hidden from public view, and Reade was determined to kick the doors open and shine a bright light in those dark corners. He did this most famously in his novel, Hard Cash. His method here is just brilliant. See, he didn't write an essay, he created a character, John Mardale, a perfectly sane man who gets thrown into an asylum by his greedy family. And through John's eyes, you, the reader, experience the abuse, the corruption, and just how terrifyingly easy it was for someone to be stripped of their freedom. So Hard Cash wasn't just a thriller, it was a call to action, and he did his homework. By wrapping his carefully researched facts in this high-stakes, dramatic story, he sparked genuine public outrage. He basically laid out this powerful case for reforming the entire mental health system, forcing his readers to look at a reality most of them would have much rather ignored. And believe me, he did not stop with asylums. Oh no. Across his other books, like The Wandering Heir, he took aim at all the biggest issues of his time. He was constantly questioning the super rigid class system, the fairness of the courts, and the crushing weight of what society demanded from people. He was always poking at the weak spots. But here's the twist. If you're thinking Reed was just this super serious guy writing bleak, heavy stories, you'd be mistaken. He was also a master entertainer who loved to write about romance, crime, and high adventure. And this, right here, is the secret to his success. His social messages hit so hard because they were basically smuggled inside these incredibly popular stories. People lined up to read his books because they were exciting, they were romantic, they were full of suspense. The social commentary was the medicine, but he delivered it in the sweetest tasting candy imaginable. I mean, his range was just incredible. One minute he could transport you to the 15th century with a huge historical epic like The Cloister and the Hearth. The next, he'd have you on the edge of your seat with a crime thriller like Foul Play. He could even make you laugh out loud with a romantic comedy. The guy could really do it all. So what does this all add up to? When you look at the whole picture, what is Charles Reade's lasting legacy? So why do we still talk about him today? Well, because he basically created the blueprint for using popular fiction to fight for social justice. He mastered that mix of high drama and harsh reality to get people to pay attention. And maybe most importantly, he gave a voice to people who had none. And he proved, without a doubt, that a story could be wildly entertaining and deeply important at the same time. And what's really striking is how modern his concerns feel. I mean, the abuses in mental health that he exposed, we are still debating and fighting for better mental health care. His critiques of class and privilege, they sound a lot like today's conversations about social inequality. And his focus on a corrupt legal system, well, calls for justice reform are everywhere. His battlegrounds are still our battlegrounds. Ultimately, Reed's work is this powerful reminder that even though times change, the core human struggles for justice, for dignity, for fairness, those things are timeless. And he showed us all the incredible power that a single, well-told story can have to change the world. And that brings us right back to our opening question, but with a modern twist. If Charles Reed were alive right now with that same crusading spirit and that masterful pen, which of today's injustices do you think he would turn into his next great novel? That's definitely something to think about.
All right, today we're going deep on a true literary giant. I'm talking about a name that basically is the Victorian novel. But what's so fascinating is that behind that famous name is this incredible story of rebellion, genius, and a woman who completely changed the game for writers forever. So let me just ask you this. When you think of the absolute heavyweights of the English novel, who pops into your head? Dickens, right? Maybe Austen? Well, what if I told you that one of the most profound, most influential voices of all time belonged to someone that almost everybody back then thought was a man? George is the author behind masterpieces like Middlemarch, a book so good that Virginia Woolf famously said it was one of the few English novels written for grown-up people. But the name itself, George Eliot, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And here it is, the big reveal. George Eliot was actually the pen name for Mary Ann Evans, who was born way back on November 22nd, 1819. Now, she didn't just pick a male name on a whim. She had two really powerful reasons that go right to the heart of who she was and what she was up against. First, and this quote just says it all, doesn't it? She wanted her work to be taken seriously. She knew it had to be judged on its brain power, on its merit, and not just get brushed aside as some sentimental, silly novel by a lady novelist, a type of book she really couldn't stand. And second, she desperately needed to build a wall between her work and her private life, which for the time was seen as pretty scandalous. So, let's get into it. Let's pull back the curtain on the woman behind that very famous man's name. I mean, how did a girl from the English countryside become one of the sharpest, most formidable minds of her entire generation? You know, what's just wild when you look at this timeline is how fast her thinking evolved. She started out as this deeply religious evangelical Christian, but she was a voracious reader, and as she connected with more and more free thinkers, she started to question, well, everything. That led to this huge crisis of faith, and she ended up calling herself an unbeliever.
And listen, this wasn't just some abstract idea. It caused a massive, painful break with her family when she flat out refused to go to church anymore. That was a huge act of defiance in Victorian England. And her rebellion did not stop with religion. Oh no. When she got to London, she met this brilliant philosopher and critic, George Henry Lewis. The only catch, Lewis was married. And in an age where getting a divorce was basically impossible, they made a decision that was just shocking. They decided to live together, openly, as husband and wife, but with no legal marriage.
The social price she paid was just enormous. She was basically shunned, treated like she was a fallen woman. And this quote, wow, this is from a letter her own brother, Isaac, sent her. It's just brutal. He cut off all contact with her for almost 25 years. Think about that, a silence that was only broken when she finally did get legally married much, much later in her life. But here's the twist. It's this very personal exile, this scandal, that paradoxically created the space for her to spark a professional revolution. It was her partner, George Henry Lewis, who really saw her genius and was the one who pushed her, saying, you need to stop just translating and critiquing. You need to write fiction. And by doing that, she literally reinvented the novel.
This quote from D.H. Lawrence just nails it. This was her greatest innovation. See, before Eliot, most novels were all about external stuff, the plot, the action, the adventure. But as Lawrence said, Eliot put the action on the inside. She was a pioneer of what we now call psychological realism. She dove deep, deep into the inner worlds of her characters, their messy motives, their secret self-deceptions, their moral struggles. And you can just see this new approach getting stronger and stronger across her incredible list of books. I mean, from her very first work, Scenes of Clerical Life, her insight was so sharp that Charles Dickens himself wrote to her and said he suspected the author had to be a woman because of what he called its womanly touch. And he was right. From there, the masterpieces just kept coming, cementing her reputation. And then came Middlemarch. Now, the subtitle is A Study of Provincial Life, but don't let that fool you into thinking it's a small book. It is vast. It's like this panoramic view of an entire town, weaving together all these different stories to look at politics, social change, marriage, ambition. It doesn't just tell you one person's story, it tells you the story of an entire society in flux. And that famous line from Virginia Woolf gets it exactly right. This is a novel that refuses to give you simple heroes and villains. No, what it gives you are complicated, flawed, deeply real people who are all struggling with the gap between their big dreams and the messy reality of their lives. It's a novel with incredible intellectual and emotional depth. So, why does George Eliot still matter so much? I mean, why does she feel so incredibly relevant even today? What's the core lesson that she's teaching us from across the centuries? Let's break down her most powerful gifts to us. Okay, first, she proved that novels could be a place for huge ideas, that fiction could be just as smart and rigorous as philosophy. Second, she gave us characters who feel totally real because their biggest fights are the ones happening inside their own heads. But honestly, it's this third gift, radical empathy, that might be her most important legacy. I mean, here it is, in our own words. This is basically her mission statement. Her goal wasn't just to tell you a good story. It was to expand your moral imagination, to make you feel on a gut level what it's like to be somebody else, especially someone who's just ordinary and flawed and trying their best. And this line from Middlemarch, what a powerful metaphor. It's the perfect way to understand her mission. What she's saying is that so-called ordinary life isn't boring at all. In fact, it's so packed with drama and pain and meaning that if we could actually see and feel all of it at once, the intensity, that roar, would completely overwhelm us. Her books just give us a little peek behind that curtain of silence. Which really brings us to a final question, for right here and right now. George Eliot used her novels to build these bridges of understanding between people. She was always challenging her readers to look past their own biases and see the shared humanity in others. So, in our own world, which can feel so divided sometimes, how can we take up that challenge? How can we practice her kind of radical empathy?
Today, we're diving into the work of a 19th century literary giant, a master of wit whose critique of society, well, it might feel a little too familiar. His name is William Makepeace Thackeray. Look, everyone knows Charles Dickens, right? His name is basically synonymous with the Victorian era. But here's the thing. Back in the day, he had a fierce literary rival, another heavyweight author whose name you absolutely should know. So what was the difference? Well, while Dickens was pulling at your heartstrings and making you feel all the feels, Thackeray, he took a totally different route. He was this cool, detached observer using irony and wit like a surgeon's scalpel to dissect society. You could say Dickens wanted you to cry for his characters, but Thackeray, he wanted you to raise an eyebrow at yourself. And that, right there, is where you find Thackeray's true genius. He wasn't just telling stories for the sake of it. No, he was a social satirist. He looked around at a world obsessed with greed, ambition, and putting on a good show, and he made it his job to pull back the curtain on the whole performance. This really gets to the heart of his unique voice. See, unlike a lot of his peers, Thackeray kept his distance. His narration feels critical, almost like a witty commentator pointing out how absurd all the social games are. He wasn't there to make you feel comfortable. He was there to make you think. To really get a handle on Thackeray, we have to look at the masterpiece that basically cemented his legacy, a novel that pretty much broke all the rules of its time, Vanity Fair. I mean, that subtitle alone was revolutionary. Back then, Victorian novels were supposed to have clear heroes and heroines, good, virtuous people you could cheer for. Thackeray basically announces right from the get-go, nope, you're not going to find one of those here. He's telling us that in the world he's about to show us, real heroes might not even exist. And the title itself? That's the whole point. It's not just a clever name. It actually comes from this old 17th century story where Vanity Fair is this endless market of materialism and moral shortcuts. So Thackeray is essentially saying, welcome to my world. It's one big corrupt fair and everyone's selling something. The whole novel's critique is built around the journeys of two very, very different women. They represent two competing ways to get through this messed up world. So let's meet them. First up, we have Becky Sharp, and let me tell you, she is one of the most unforgettable characters in all of English literature. She's an orphan with no money, no connections, but she is brilliant, charming, and has absolutely zero scruples. Becky sees society for the game it is, and she is determined to win, no matter who she has to use along the way. And her total opposite is Amelia Sedley. Amelia is everything Victorian society claimed it admired in a woman. She's sweet, loving, completely selfless. But Thackeray subtly shows us the weakness in that ideal. Her innocence and her passivity just make her a victim, completely unable to handle the harsh realities of Vanity Fair. And this just perfectly sets up Thackeray's central question. Does this society really reward the supposed goodness of someone like Amelia? Or does it reward the ruthless ambition of someone like Becky? By the end of the book, Thackeray gives a pretty clear and pretty damning answer. One of the other really cool things is how Thackeray tells the story. He's not some invisible narrator. Oh no. He constantly breaks the fourth wall to talk directly to us, the readers. He'll drop in a cynical comment here, a witty remark there. It makes you feel like you're his co-conspirator, watching all the silliness unfold together. And while Vanity Fair is his most famous work, this sharp critique of society became his signature move. It was not a one-off. This theme of hypocrisy runs through pretty much all of his major novels. So yeah, across his other books, the settings might change, but that core idea is always there. In Pendennis, he looks at ambition versus status. In The Newcomes, he shows how the chase for money can poison a family for generations. Even in a historical novel like Henry Esmond, he's still digging into these dilemmas of honor and social pressure. The theme is constant. It's the fight between who we want to be and what a corrupt society tells us we should be. And really, that's the heart of his legacy. Thackeray was a master at exposing hypocrisy. He held up a mirror to a world that paid lip service to things like kindness and integrity, but when it came down to it, really saved its biggest prizes for those who were rich, powerful, or just really, really good at faking it. Which, brings us to one last thought. In our modern world, with its obsession with status, online influencers, and relentless ambition, you gotta ask yourself, did we ever really leave Vanity Fair? Or did we just build a digital version of it? All right, let's get right into it. When you hear the name Charles Dickens, you probably think of these incredible characters and wild, sprawling stories. But here's the thing. His genius went way beyond just telling a good story. Dickens was a genuine force of nature, a writer who picked up his pen and used it like a weapon to fight the injustices of his time. And believe it or not, he actually changed the world. I mean, it's a massive question, right? How can a bunch of words on a page actually make a difference in the real world? Well, that is exactly what we're going to break down. We're going to see how Dickens was a master at weaving together pure entertainment with this fierce social mission that made his readers not just feel something, but want to do something. And this is the key thing you got to get about Dickens. He wasn't just writing about the world he saw, he was putting the whole thing on trial. His books were these vivid, in-your-face portraits of what it was like to be poor, how corrupt the big institutions were, and just the moral rot at the heart of this new industrial society. He held up a mirror, and a lot of people did not like what they saw. Now, to understand the fire in his writing, you have to know where it came from. Dickens's passion for change wasn't something he just read about in a book. Oh no, it was personal. It was forged in the pain of his own childhood. And you can literally pinpoint the moment everything changed for him. 1824. He's only 12 years old, and his entire world just falls apart. His dad gets thrown into debtor's prison, and little Charles is forced to go work in this grimy boot-blacking factory. And that experience, the shame, the hardship, it stuck with him forever. It gave him this incredible empathy for people who were struggling, and a burning desire to expose the systems that caused all that pain. So with that fire in his belly, what does he do? Well, the second he gets a public platform, he uses it. His first novels weren't just novels. They were bombshells, designed to blast a hole in the wall and let some light into the darkest corners of Victorian England. And one of his first big targets was the workhouse. Now, on paper, these places were supposed to help the poor. But the reality was a nightmare. As Dickens showed the world, they were often these brutal, cruel institutions, basically designed to punish you for the crime of being poor. It was just a grim, hopeless existence for thousands of people. And then came Oliver Twist. What Dickens did here was nothing short of revolutionary. He took this abstract idea of poverty and he gave it a face and a name. Suddenly, this poor, innocent orphan, Oliver, became a symbol for a whole generation of abused kids. Dickens basically dragged the filthy, brutal reality of the workhouse right into the fancy living rooms of the middle class, forcing them to look at a world they'd been trying really, really hard to pretend didn't exist. But he was just getting started. After taking on the workhouses, his next crusade was against another broken institution that was chewing up and spitting out children, the corrupt, for-profit boarding schools that were all over the country. So in Nicholas Nickleby, he creates one of the all-time great literary villains, the truly awful headmaster, Wackford Squeers. His school, Dotheboys Hall, became the symbol for all the neglect and abuse happening in these places that were supposed to be educating kids. The book's description was so shocking, so real, that it actually led to reforms of the school system in Yorkshire. I mean, just think about that. A novel literally changed the law. That's real power. So as Dickens gets older, his writing gets even more ambitious. He starts to see that villains like Fagin or Squeers, well, they were just symptoms of a much bigger sickness. The real problem was the failure of society's core institutions. You can almost track the evolution in his books. He starts by zooming in on the story of one person, like Oliver Twist. Then he pulls the camera back a bit to attack a whole institution, like Dotheboys Hall. And finally, he goes for the whole shebang, condemning entire rotten systems, like the courts, the government, the whole way the economy was set up. And if you want proof of this bigger picture attack, look no further than his masterpiece, Bleak House. This quote from the book just says it all, doesn't it? It's such a savage takedown of a legal system that he saw as just completely self-serving and totally disconnected from actual justice. The whole story of Bleak House spins around this ridiculous court case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, that just goes on and on for generations, bankrupting and destroying the lives of everyone involved. It's this brilliant, devastating metaphor for a legal system so tangled up in its own red tape that it actually does more harm than good. It's a massive, complex attack on a broken system. And this just gives you a glimpse of how wide his net was. He went after the broken legal system, the soul-crushing greed of big business, the mind-numbing effects of industrialization in hard times. He even invented something called the Circumlocution Office in Little Dorrit, which was his hilarious take on a government department whose only job was to figure out how not to do anything. Seriously, no part of society was safe from his pen. So after all this, after a whole career spent fighting these battles with his stories, what's the ultimate legacy? Why are we still talking about him, reading him, watching movies of his work more than 150 years after he died? Well, I think you can find the answer in what might be his most perfect story, A Christmas Carol. It's so much more than a holiday tale. It's basically Dickens's entire philosophy, his most important message to the world, all wrapped up in one unforgettable little package. See, at the end of the day, Scrooge's transformation is the transformation Dickens wanted for all of society. Through this one guy, he argues that anyone can change, that nobody is beyond hope. The story is a massive plea for empathy, for kindness, for looking out for each other. Scrooge represents all the problems of greed, and poor Tiny Tim gives a human face to the innocent victims of that greed. It's a reminder that what we do, or what we fail to do, matters. And the man was a machine. He pushed these messages out relentlessly. Get this, 15 major novels, and that's not even counting the 5 novellas and hundreds of short stories and articles. He wasn't just a writer, he was a one-man media empire, shaping public opinion on a scale that's hard to even imagine today. So his legacy is, well, it's immense. He didn't just write amazing books. He helped redefine what a novel could even do. He proved that storytelling could be a powerful tool for social good, shaping the way we think about justice and our responsibility to one another to this very day. And that all leads to one last fascinating question. Back then, his targets were the workhouses, the broken legal system, the unchecked greed of his time. So if he were here right now, writing in our world, what would he see? What parts of our society would he put on trial? I think the greatest tribute to his legacy is that we can still ask that question. And the scary part is we can all probably think of a few answers. Have you ever heard of a literary masterpiece that started out as a spectacular failure? I mean, a complete flop? Well, today we're diving into an incredible story about art, about persistence, and about how some of the most beautiful words ever written almost disappeared without a trace. Just listen to those words. Awake from morning in the bowl of night has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight. I mean, wow. These are the opening lines of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. They're haunting, they're philosophical. They talk about these huge universal ideas of life and death and meaning. They just feel timeless, don't they? Like they were always meant to be famous. And yet, they weren't. Not at first. When this poetry collection was published back in 1859, it landed with a thud. Seriously, it found pretty much no audience, no success, no celebration whatsoever. So how on earth did this profound work go from being totally forgotten to a global sensation? That's the puzzle we're going to solve. Okay, so to really get this story, we've got to meet the man who brought these words into the English-speaking world. His name was Edward Fitzgerald. He was a 19th century English poet and writer, and as you're about to see, his whole approach to translation was, well, it was anything but ordinary. See, Fitzgerald wasn't interested in just a simple word-for-word dictionary-style translation. You got to think of him less like a translator and more like an artistic interpreter, or maybe even like a modern-day music producer remixing a classic song. He believed that to make this 11th century Persian poetry really connect with his Victorian audience, he had to capture its spirit, its soul, its flow, not just the literal meaning of the words. And this idea, what he called an artistic rendering, was honestly pretty controversial. To the purists, what he was doing wasn't really translation at all. But Fitzgerald's whole argument was that to translate the experience, the actual feeling of reading the poem in Persian, he had to create something new for the English ear. He wasn't just translating a text, he was trying to translate a feeling. And you know, his passion for building these kinds of cultural bridges, it didn't just start and end with Omar Khayyam. Fitzgerald was actually a really prolific translator. He seemed driven by this deep need to bring all these incredible literary traditions from around the world home to his fellow Englishmen. And just look at this timeline. The sheer range here is incredible, right? He wasn't just a one-trick pony, specializing only in Persian poetry. He started with his own original work. Then he dives into these passionate Spanish dramas. He explores a mystical Persian allegory. And even after the Rubaiyat, he takes on the huge task of translating the Greek tragedy of Agamemnon. The guy was a true literary explorer. So here's the crucial point. He wasn't just dabbling, he was immersing himself in the deepest philosophical ideas of each of these cultures. I mean, from the Persian concept of the soul's journey to Spanish metaphysics, all the way to Greek ideas of fate and tragedy. It was this deep, genuine engagement with world thought that gave him the confidence to take such a bold, artistic approach with the Rubaiyat. So all of this work was about building bridges between different worlds. But let's circle back now to the Rubaiyat. because it's this work that would end up cementing his legacy and really change how the West saw Eastern literature forever. So let's go right back to that starting point. 1859. The book is published and crickets. Nothing. It was a complete and total commercial flop. A really quiet failure for a work that Fitzgerald had poured so much of himself and his philosophy into. But then something amazing happened. The book didn't get discovered through fancy reviews or marketing campaigns. Nope, it found its audience almost by accident. A few copies were discovered in the bargain bin of a bookstore by some really influential artists, the Pre-Raphaelites. And at a time when Victorian society was super rigid and buttoned up, they were totally captivated by the poem's sensual, live-for-the-moment philosophy. They shared it with their friends, and slowly, this forgotten little book began to catch fire and became a massive cultural phenomenon. So when you step back and look at it, what's the big takeaway here? Fitzgerald's legacy is just immense. He didn't just translate a book, he basically opened a door to a whole new world for Western readers. He introduced Persian poetry on a massive scale and totally shaped how generations viewed foreign literature. His work proved that a translation focused on the spirit over the literal word, this artistic rendering, could have an impact every bit as powerful as an original work. And that really brings us to our final thought. Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat isn't just seen as a translation anymore. It's a work of art that stands entirely on its own, loved by millions. And it forces us to ask this really interesting question. Where is the line between a translator and an author? Can that act of interpretation, of building a bridge between two worlds, actually become its own unique masterpiece? It's something to think about. Today, we're diving into the story of a poet, a guy whose words honestly feel like they could have been written yesterday. But here's the crazy part. He was writing them way back in a world of gaslight and steam. So let's start with a big what if. What if you invented the future of poetry, but nobody, and I mean nobody, read your work until long after you were gone? Just think about that for a second. Creating something so game-changing that it totally reshapes an art form, but you never get to see the impact. Well, that's the incredible and kind of tragic story of Gerard Manley Hopkins. So who was this guy? On the surface, Hopkins was a 19th century Jesuit priest, living this life of quiet, serious devotion. But underneath all that, wow, he had a mind that was just on fire. He was creating a style of poetry so new, so energetic, that we now see him as one of the people who kicked off modernism. And the kicker? Almost none of it was published while he was alive. And this is the real tension at the heart of his work. His poems are just soaked in this deep spirituality, this constant search for God. But to get those feelings out, he couldn't use the old tools. No way. He had to completely shatter the smooth, predictable poetry of his day. What he made instead was something, it was raw, it was muscular, and it was completely new. All right, so how on earth did he pull this off? Well, if you really want to get Hopkins, you have to understand his secret weapon. It was his greatest innovation, and he called it sprung rhythm. And trust me, it gave poetry a sound nobody had ever heard before. Okay, so what is sprung rhythm? Think about traditional poetry, right? It's often very predictable. It counts every single syllable, which can make it sound a little sing-songy. Hopkins just took that rulebook and tossed it out the window. His sprung rhythm is all about the natural, punchy rhythms of how we actually talk. It's meant to sound dynamic and powerful, like you're listening to someone speaking from the heart, not just reading a poem. Just listen to this line from his epic poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland. Thou mastering me, God, giver of breath and bread. Do you feel that? It's not smooth at all, is it? It's this powerful, almost tumbling rhythm that just hits you. That's the whole point. He wanted you to feel the force of those stressed words. And this radical new rhythm wasn't just him showing off. Not at all. Hopkins needed it to express his biggest, most important theme, finding the overwhelming, almost ecstatic presence of God in the natural world. And this is where his poetry really just takes flight. I mean, just listen to this. It's one of the most famous opening lines in all of English poetry. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It's not just a statement, is it? It's an electric declaration. For Hopkins, nature wasn't just, pretty. It was literally pulsing with divine energy, charged up like a battery. And his nature poems really dig into this idea from every possible angle. He was convinced that God's presence was right here, visible in absolutely everything around us. He also wasn't blind to what was happening. He saw how industry was scarring the landscape, but he had this unshakable belief that nature and the divine spirit inside it would always, always bounce back. And you can really see his unique way of looking at the world in this amazing little poem called Pied Beauty. See, he doesn't write about the perfect, flawless rose or the majestic, uniform mountain. Nope. He praises God for, as he calls them, dappled things. The spotted, the multicolored, the imperfect, even the strange stuff. For Hopkins, that variety was the proof of God's genius. So he starts this incredible catalog of praise for dappled things. Then he gets even more specific for rose moles and for the brinded cow. You see how he does that? It's this rapid fire list that just gives you this feeling of joyful, almost breathless praise for all the quirky details of creation. Okay, but Hopkins' faith wasn't always the simple, joyful thing. Not even close. Later in his life, he was serving as a priest in Dublin, and he just got swallowed by this period of intense depression and spiritual despair. The poems he wrote then, well, they're known today as the terrible sonnets for a reason. And the change is just jarring. It's night and day. We go from those nature poems full of joy and wonder, where God is literally everywhere, to these poems that are just filled with agony and isolation. Suddenly, God feels impossibly far away. Maybe not even there at all. It just shows you the incredible emotional range this man had. I mean, just look at how violent the language gets here. He's talking directly to despair, and he calls it carrion comfort. That's like comfort made of rotting flesh. He is in an all-out war inside his own head, refusing to give in, fighting like hell to hold on to his faith, even when it feels like it's causing him nothing but pain. And in this poem, you can just feel the pure agony of what it's like to feel abandoned by God. He says the darkness is like a fell, that's an animal's hide, like it's a physical suffocating weight on top of him. But here's what's so powerful. These poems aren't him giving up on his faith. They're proof of how hard he fought for it, even when he was in the darkest place imaginable. So you've got this brilliant, tortured priest writing stuff that is truly ahead of its time. And then he dies, a total unknown. So the big question is, how did this hidden revolution ever see the light of day? This timeline really tells the whole story, doesn't it? He writes his absolute masterpieces in the 1870s and 80s, but they don't get published for almost 30 years after he's gone. It took that long for the rest of the world to finally catch up to what he was doing. And when the world did catch up, his impact was just massive. That sprung rhythm of his blew the doors wide open for poets like T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden to start experimenting. He proved that poetry about God could be earthy and physical, not just airy and abstract. And maybe most importantly, he made the words themselves, the sounds, the rhythms, the star of the show. This line, for me, it just sums it all up. What I do is me, for that I came. It comes from a poem where he basically says that everything in the world, a bird, an insect, a person, fulfills its purpose just by being its own unique self. And in doing that, it reflects its creator. For Hopkins, his wild, unique, rule-breaking poetry, that was him. That was his purpose. And really, that was his ultimate message. He believed that every single one of us reflects something divine in a way that is totally unique. So he kind of leaves us with this big, profound question to chew on. What's your unique self-expression? How does the world, in all its weird and wonderful glory, reflect itself through you?
All right, so when you picture the Victorian era, what pops into your head? Probably a lot of lace, super strict manners, very repressed. Well, get ready, because we are about to blow that idea out of the water. Today, we're diving headfirst into the story of a poet who basically took a sledgehammer to everything the Victorians held dear. Yeah, the image most of us have of the 19th century is this world of just rigid rules and very public piety. We think of a society that's buttoned up right to the chin, both literally and, figuratively. A time when art was supposed to be noble, heroic, and above all else, proper. But what if I told you that just beneath that very calm, very controlled surface, there was this whole world of rebellion, of radical politics, and a sensuality that was, frankly, scandalous? Because that is exactly the world we're about to uncover. Okay, but before we meet our rebel, we really need to understand the world he was rebelling against. And honestly, there is no better example of the Victorian ideal than one of the era's most famous figures, the poet and designer William Morris.
Morris was an absolute giant of his time. I mean, he looked backwards to medieval craftsmanship, to these epic Norse myths, as a way to create powerful, heroic art for his own time. His whole vision was about bringing beauty and real skill into every single corner of life. His epic poem, Sigurd to Volsung, is the perfect example of this. It's this grand, traditional story celebrating ancient heroes. In so many ways, he was the Victorian ideal.
And then, well, then there was Algernon Charles Swinburne. And he wasn't interested in reviving tradition. He was interested in blowing it right up. So while Morris was busy building these beautiful things, Swinburne was over here building bombs out of words, and he was aiming them right at the very foundations of Victorian society.
So first up, he took on religion. In an age where being devoutly Christian was just the norm, Swinburne's work was openly and completely defiant in its atheism.
Next, he dragged desire in all its messy, complicated glory right out into the open. I mean, his poetry didn't just hint at passion, it dove right into the taboo connection between pleasure and pain. He shocked his readers with a sensuality that was so raw, so direct, and just completely unapologetic.
And finally, he went after the state. He was a radical Republican, calling for revolution and celebrating freedom from tyranny. This guy wasn't just a poet, he was a one-man cultural insurgency.
So who was this guy? Algernon Charles Swinburne was a true master of the English language. I mean, a brilliant technician of poetic rhythm and sound. But he used that incredible mastery to explore the most controversial, the most hot-button subjects of his day, which made him this figure of both absolute fascination and total public scandal. So, okay, we've heard the charges. Atheist, sensualist, revolutionary. Now let's look at the actual evidence. It's time to open the books and see for ourselves why his work caused such an absolute firestorm. Everything just exploded in 1866 with this one collection, Poems and Ballads. This was the book that made him infamous. It was a full-on assault on Victorian morality, jam-packed with themes of paganism, eroticism, and this really deep-seated rebellion. Just take this line from his infamous poem Dolores. I am faint with love, for thy love I am sore in a strait. Now he's not just saying he's lovesick, sore in a strait. That means to be in a painful, really difficult situation. He is explicitly linking intense love with intense suffering. This was not the pure, chaste, romantic love of his time. No way. This was a painful, all-consuming, almost violent force. For Victorian readers, this was just beyond shocking. And he didn't stop there. In the hymn to Proserpine, he writes from the perspective of a Roman pagan who is watching Christianity take over the world. And the speaker isn't celebrating this new era of faith. He's mourning the death of the old gods and all the freedom they represented. You see, for Swinburne, paganism was the ultimate symbol of protest. It represented a world that was free from all the moral rules and the guilt of Victorian Christianity. So by celebrating it, he was basically holding up a mirror to his own society and criticizing what he saw as its suffocating and repressive nature. In this chart, it just nails the core of his work perfectly. His poetry was this potent cocktail of rebellion, radical politics, and a deep, deep love for classical mythology, which he then used as a weapon against the status quo. You can really see this in collections like Songs Before Sunrise, which was just this fiery call for political and personal freedom all across Europe. He also had this incredible, almost spiritual connection to nature, especially the sea. So in a poem like The Swimmer's Dream, the ocean becomes this amazing metaphor. It's a symbol of sublime power, of danger, and of freedom. It's this place where you could struggle against these immense forces, all in pursuit of something you could probably never even reach. So Swinburne's rebellion was loud, it was explosive. But he wasn't the only poet pushing against the rules. To really get the full picture, we need to look at another innovator from that time, one who took a completely different path to his own kind of revolution, the Jesuit priest Gerard Manley Hopkins. I mean, the contrast here is just stunning. While Swinburne's rebellion was loud, it was public, and it was aimed at society, Hopkins' revolution was quiet, internal, and deeply spiritual. So you have Swinburne, the atheist, using this lush, sensual language to challenge morality, and then you have Hopkins, the Jesuit priest, who invented this radical new poetic meter called sprung rhythm, which was designed to sound more like natural speech, to explore his intense religious faith. Both of them were breaking the rules of poetry, but they were headed in completely opposite directions.
Okay, so after all the scandal, all the controversy, what was the lasting impact of Swinburne's provocation? I mean, did it actually change anything in the long run?
Oh, absolutely. His legacy is immense. For one, he was a technical master, and his skill with meter and form influenced generations of poets. But even more importantly, he just kicked the door wide open. He proved that poetry could tackle taboo subjects, that it could be both sensual and intellectual, and that it could be a really powerful tool for radical change. He basically gave future writers permission to be daring. And that's really the crucial point here. His rebellion wasn't just for shock value. It was fueled by this profound and really sincere commitment to the ideals of political and personal freedom. That's the engine that was driving all of his most scandalous and his most beautiful work. Which kind of leaves us with a question for our own time, doesn't it? Swinburne made the comfortable Victorians profoundly uncomfortable, and he forced them to confront ideas they would have much rather ignored. So it makes you wonder, who are the artists that are doing that today? And what are they forcing us to see?
All right, let's get into it. Today, we're talking about William Morris, a true giant of the Victorian era. Now, you might be thinking you don't know the name, but I promise you his influence is all around you in ways you probably never even expected. So let's just start with this bombshell. This guy, this 19th century designer, is basically one of the founding fathers of an entire literary genre. Seriously, before there was a Middle Earth, there were the incredible, richly imagined worlds of William Morris. And at the exact same time, he was the genius behind some of the most iconic, timeless patterns in home design. So how on earth does the father of fantasy also become the king of wallpaper? Well, it all kicks off with his passionate, deep-seated hatred for the modern world. Look, to get Morris, you first have to get his enemy, the Industrial Revolution. Imagine Victorian England. It's this world of what they called progress, right? But it came at a huge cost. Cities were choking on smoke. Factories were just churning out endless identical junk, and the human touch was basically being engineered out of existence. Morris looked at all this and didn't see progress. He saw a disaster. And this, right here, this captures the two worlds that were at war in his mind. On one side, you have the old way, handmade craftsmanship. Where skilled people found real joy and meaning in their work, creating things of beauty for everyday life. And on the other side, you've got the new industrial world. Morris saw it as completely dehumanizing, something that ripped workers away from their craft and just stripped all the artistry from the world. This one single conflict, it defined his entire life. So who was this guy who dared to stand up and fight the tide of history? William Morris was this incredible force of nature, a poet, a designer, a novelist, and a fiery social activist. He saw the ugliness of the industrial age and decided he was going to fight it, not just with ideas, but with his own two hands. And he wasn't fighting alone. Morris became a leading voice in what we now call the arts and crafts movement. The whole philosophy was simple, but at the time, totally revolutionary. Push back against the machine. Let's bring real beauty and skill back into people's homes. It was a call to arms to make everyday life beautiful again. And this is how he put his philosophy into practice. The man didn't just talk, he built. He started Morris & Co., which was basically a direct assault on mass production. As you can see, they made everything by hand. Textiles, furniture, you name it, focusing on those traditional techniques and quality materials he felt the world was losing. Of course, this created a really interesting problem. Morris was a socialist who wanted art for the people, but because his stuff was so labor-intensive, it was super expensive. Only the rich could afford it. It was this tension he wrestled with his whole life. But still, his company wasn't just a business. It was a manifesto you could hang on your walls. But fighting a war against industrialization takes more than just beautiful chairs. Morris also used the page as a weapon. He started writing, creating entire worlds that were completely free from the machine. This was the second front in his rebellion. And what's so wild is just the sheer range of his writing. In a book like News from Nowhere, he literally draws a blueprint for a socialist utopia, where nature and craftsmanship have totally replaced capitalism. Then, in his fantasy novels like The Well at the World's End, he builds these mythic, pre-industrial worlds where quests for meaning are everything. Even his poetry was all about reviving these grand old sagas. It was all part of the same project, you see, to imagine a better, more human way to exist. This quote just nails it. It really gets to the core of his vision, especially in News from Nowhere. For Morris, the end goal wasn't just to tear down a system. It was to build a new one, where the work itself, the act of creating, was a source of genuine joy and fulfillment, not misery. So, you might be asking, did he lose? Did his war against the machine fail? Not even close. I mean, sure, he didn't stop industrialization, but the ideas he planted, man, they are still growing and spreading today. His vision has had this incredibly long and fascinating afterlife. We can really break his massive legacy down into three key areas. He laid the foundation for modern fantasy as we know it. He gave a powerful artistic voice to socialism. And he pioneered ideas about ethical, sustainable design that are frankly more relevant today than ever. Okay, this one is huge. J.R.R. Tolkien himself was a huge admirer of Morris's work. He loved how Morris could create these incredibly detailed, immersive pre-industrial worlds. It's not a stretch to say that without Morris's heroic quests and imagined medieval landscapes, the entire fantasy genre might look completely different today. And this brings everything right back to our world, right now. That core idea of the arts and crafts movement, that the things we make and live with should be beautiful, built to last, and ethically made, that's the DNA of today's movements for sustainability and conscious consumerism. His fight is still our fight. So we'll end with this question. As we stand here, right on the edge of another massive revolution, this one driven by AI and automation, all of Morris's old questions are suddenly screamingly urgent again. What is the value of human skill? What is the role of beauty in a world that only values efficiency? He spent his life fighting the last machine age. His legacy might just be the blueprint we need to figure out how to navigate the next one.
You know, when you think of Victorian England, there's this one family name that just looms large in art and literature: Rossetti. But here's the thing, within that single name, you have two totally distinct voices, two brilliant minds. Today, we're going to dive deep into the world of the Rossettis, but we're really going to focus on the profound, and let's be honest, often overlooked genius of Christina Rossetti. We want to figure out what makes her voice still hit so hard, even today. Come buy our orchard fruits. Come buy, come buy. It's such a simple line, right? But this is the tempting, dangerous call at the very heart of Christina Rossetti's most famous poem. It's a line that just pulls you in, mixing this incredible sweetness with a sense of dread. And that tension, that's exactly where we're going to start.
Because really, that's the core question, isn't it? What happens when the thing you want most is also the thing that could destroy you? This isn't just some old-fashioned Victorian problem, it's a timeless human puzzle, and Rossetti just explores it with this incredible depth and feeling. Okay, so first things first. To really get Christina, you have to understand the whole Rossetti legacy. She and her brother, Dante Gabriel, were a total creative powerhouse. But, and this is the interesting part, they channeled all that energy in fascinatingly different ways. And you can really see the difference when you put them side by side. Dante Gabriel, he was the painter-poet. He was a huge deal in the pre-Raphaelite movement, and his work is just filled with this rich, sensual, mythological imagery. Christina, on the other hand, she was the introspective poet. Her focus was completely inward. It was all about faith, devotion, and the spirit. Sure, they both talked about love and death, but they were coming at it from completely different worlds. So what is it that really defines Christina's voice? What makes it so different? Let's get to the core of her unique genius and really explore the faith and feeling that makes her poetry last. It all really boils down to this idea: introspective verse. Her work is basically a journey into the inner world. She wasn't just writing about things that happened. She was dissecting these deep spiritual and emotional experiences with a kind of raw honesty that was, well, it was rare and incredibly powerful. It's like her poetry becomes a mirror for your own inner world. And her poetry is just wrestling with all these huge internal conflicts. You've got the classic battle between earthly desire and spiritual duty, right? The tough journey of faith, the way we cling to memories, and something that's so important, the inner lives of women who are dealing with some massive societal restrictions. And nowhere, and I mean nowhere, are these themes more vivid than in her masterpiece, Goblin Market. It's this incredible tale of temptation, sacrifice, and ultimately redemption. So the story revolves around three key players. You've got Laura, the sister who gives in to the goblin's tempting fruits. Then there's her sister, Lizzie, who is the brave protector. And, of course, you have the goblin merchants themselves, these bizarre creatures selling dangerous, enchanted treats. The poem unfolds like this powerful allegory. First, there's the temptation, that seductive call of the goblins. Then comes indulgence, when Laura eats the fruit and gets desperately sick. And then we get to the most crucial moment, sacrifice. Lizzie confronts the goblins, not to fight them, but to endure their abuse just to get the cure for her sister. And that act leads to the final step, redemption. It turns out that sisterly love is the ultimate saving grace. But hold on, it's not just some simple religious story. A lot of people read Goblin Market as a really sharp feminist commentary. I mean, think about it. In an era that was super strict about female desire, this poem explores it so openly. And more importantly, it offers redemption through female solidarity, not through some guy saving the day, but through a sister's love. It's that complexity that makes this poem so good. All right, so beyond the epic story of Goblin Market, Rossetti was an absolute master of the short, personal poem. Her sonnets are these quiet, profound meditations on love, memory, and loss. Just listen to the opening of one of her most beloved sonnets. Remember. It starts with this hauntingly simple line. Remember me when I am gone away. It's a plea that immediately creates this quiet intimacy and gets you ready for a really deep thought about mortality. And here's the beautiful, selfless twist. The speaker starts by asking to be remembered, right? But by the end, she says it's actually better to forget and smile than to remember and be sad. She puts her loved one's happiness above her own legacy. I mean, that's just an incredible display of deep, selfless love, all said with such simple elegance. And her emotional range was just immense. You read a poem like A Birthday and she's completely exuberant, just celebrating the joy of love. Then you turn to Uphill and she's painting life as this difficult but hopeful spiritual climb. Then you have the quiet reverence of the Christmas carol in The Bleak Midwinter, or the calm acceptance of death in Song. Every single poem shows you another facet of her incredibly deep, spiritual and emotional world. So, when you boil it all down, why are we still reading Christina Rossetti today? What's her ultimate legacy? Well, I think it lies in her incredible ability to speak to the deepest parts of what it means to be human. At the end of the day, this is why she's still such a vital voice. Her work just keeps hitting home because of its sheer lyrical beauty, its intense and honest look at faith, and its profound, unflinching dives into our inner lives. She gave a voice to feelings and struggles that are absolutely timeless. And that kind of leaves us with one final question for you to think about. Her poem, Uphill, frames life as this tough spiritual journey. So, thinking about your own life, which of its uphill journeys does her poetry maybe help you understand? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the lush, complicated, and, let's be honest, often tragic world of a true Victorian visionary. A man who absolutely lived and breathed his art. Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Okay, so let's get right to the heart of it. This question that really defined his whole career. Was Rossetti a master of words first and foremost, with poetry being his true passion? Or was his real genius found on the canvas, through all that rich color and stunning imagery? But here's the thing, you can't actually pull them apart. You know, to really understand Rossetti, you first have to get a handle on the rebellious art movement he helped create, and the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I mean, this wasn't just some new style, it was a total revolution. They basically wanted to tear up the art establishment's rulebook and bring back an emotional intensity and a vibrant, detailed reality they felt had been totally lost. So here's what we've got on tap. We're going to look at his revolutionary start as a pre-Raphaelite rebel, and how that fueled his absolute obsession with beauty. Then we'll get into the tragic shadow that love cast over his life and work, his surprising critique of his own society, and finally, what kind of legacy he really left behind. All right, let's kick things off with what was probably Rossetti's biggest driving force, this deep, powerful belief in the transcendent power of beauty and love. For him, these weren't just everyday feelings. No, they were something bigger, almost like a bridge connecting our world to the divine, the spiritual, the eternal. So he first grabs hold of this idea in one of his most famous poems, The Blessed Damozel. He's literally painting a picture with his words here. Just imagine it, a young woman leaning over the railing of heaven, right? But she isn't all peaceful and serene. No, she's filled with this intense, very human ache for the lover she had to leave back on earth. And this is what makes him so unique. See, Rossetti wasn't content to just write the poem. He had to see it, to make it real. So he took that exact poetic vision of spiritual longing and earthly desire and turned it into this absolutely breathtaking painting. For him, the words and the image were two sides of the same coin, a perfect fusion of his two great talents. And his whole obsession really comes to a head in his poetic masterpiece, the sonnet sequence, The House of Life. It's an epic journey through love in all its forms, from the incredible highs of passion and youth and change, all the way to the inevitable heartbreak of change and fate. For Rossetti, you see, love was, well, it was everything. It was this spiritual thing to be worshipped, but it was also a totally consuming earthly fire. But, and this is a huge but, here's where things take a turn. For Rossetti, who knew profound loss in his own life, intense beauty was always sort of haunted by its opposite, tragedy. His work is constantly digging into the darker side of passion, that point where love crosses the line into obsession, jealousy, and just devastating loss. So this is the key, right? This powerful tension. His art just lives in that space right between the ideal and the tragic. It's this constant tug of war. Heavenly love versus earthly obsession, divine beauty versus human sorrow, the dream of being reunited versus the cold, hard reality of vengeance and guilt.
And you can really see this darkness come alive in some of his most dramatic pieces. Take A Last Confession. Possessive love turns deadly. Then you have Sister Helen, where it twists into this cold, calculated revenge. And then there's his vision of Proserpine, which is all about being trapped, this unending, heartbreaking longing for a life you can't have anymore. And you know, this focus on death and loss, it wasn't a late career thing. It was there right from the start. One of his early poems, My Sister Sleep, just perfectly captures that quiet, gut-wrenching grief of losing someone. It really hammers home that core Rossetti theme, that conflict between the idea of a peaceful afterlife and the raw, real pain of the people left behind.
Okay, let's keep going. Because Rossetti wasn't just stuck in some fantasy world of myths and romance. He actually used that incredible insight he had into people to take a hard, critical look at the moral codes of his own Victorian society. And maybe the best example of this, the most jaw-dropping, really, is his poem Jenny. I mean, for its time, this poem was incredibly bold. It went straight at a topic that polite Victorian society did everything it could to pretend didn't exist. So what the poem does is put you right inside the mind of a young man as he sits there watching a sleeping prostitute he has paid for. And through his thoughts, Rossetti just tears into Victorian hypocrisy. He completely blows up the era's double standards and simplistic ideas about female purity, revealing the complex mix of pity, desire, and guilt that society projected onto so-called fallen women. So where does that leave us? What's the final impact of this guy who poured every ounce of his being into two totally different art forms? What is his lasting echo in the worlds of art and literature? Well, his legacy is really a body of work that's just pulsing with these core obsessions. It doesn't matter if you're looking at a painting or reading a poem, you can always feel it, right? That rich, almost touchable imagery, that super close, kind of scary link between love and death, and that deep dive into the constant battle between our spiritual hopes and our very human passions. You know, when you get right down to it, his most revolutionary act might have been his simple refusal to be just a painter or just a poet. By blending the visual and the literary, he basically invented a powerful new language to explore our inner emotional worlds. And that approach, well, it directly paved the way for the whole symbolist movement and inspired artists for generations. You see, Rossetti's own life was just as dramatic and tragic as anything he put on canvas or paper. He didn't just create his obsessions, he lived them. And that leaves us with one last, really fascinating question to think about. Does art just hold up a mirror to reality? Or, for an artist like Rossetti, who is so completely consumed by his work, does life itself start to imitate the beautiful, tragic, and intense world that the art creates?
All right, welcome. Today, we're diving into the work of a poet whose words were so much more than just beautiful. They were a weapon. We're talking about the incredible power of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So let me ask you something. How can a poem become a protest? You know, we usually think of poetry as this quiet, personal thing. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she didn't just write poems, she literally forged them into tools for social change. And today, we're going to break down exactly how she did it. Okay, to really get a handle on her power, you've got to picture her world. We're talking about the Victorian era. It was this wild time of clashing forces. You've got smoky factories booming, and right alongside that, this explosion of literary genius. And she was right in the thick of it, alongside huge names like her future husband, Robert Browning, and the artist-poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And right at the heart of this whole revolution, that's where you find her. Look, she wasn't just another voice in the chorus. She was a genuine literary superstar, and she used her passionate poetry to fearlessly tackle the biggest social issues of her day, everything from women's rights to child labor. Now, we're going to start with the work she is most famous for. But I want you to forget everything you think you know about old, stuffy love poems. This collection, it's basically a raw, deeply personal diary of her courtship with Robert Browning, all captured in 44 sonnets that reveal every single vulnerable moment. And what's so fascinating is how she told this story. I mean, she took the Petrarchan sonnet, this really rigid, super traditional, centuries-old poetic form, and she just completely bent it to her will. She broke its rules to fit her raw, modern, emotional story. And in doing that, she basically set a whole new standard for what love poetry could be. And this is really what makes the collection feel so timeless, right? You feel her vulnerability at the start, her hesitation, but then you get to witness the transformative power of love. She uses all this rich symbolism, light and darkness, nature, not just to explore her feelings, but also to subtly push back against the super strict expectations for women at the time. But here's the thing. Her love poetry, that was only one side of her genius. When she pointed her pen at the injustices happening in the world, it became an absolute weapon. She was never, ever afraid to get political. Which brings us to one of her most potent works of social critique, The Cry of the Children. And this poem, wow, this wasn't some abstract piece of art. It was a furious, direct response to a massive moral catastrophe of the industrial age. So you have to understand, at this time, inside factories and deep in the mines, kids were being exploited in just horrific conditions. And Barrett Browning absolutely refused to let this stay hidden. She used her massive platform to drag this awful reality right out into the light, writing a poem that was a direct, emotional gut punch, a plea for justice. So what was her most powerful tool here? Simple. She gives the children a voice. That haunting line, "How long?" it just echoes through the entire poem. And it's not just a line, right? It's a lament, it's an accusation, and it's a desperate plea for relief, all designed to shake the conscience of Victorian society to its core. Now, her advocacy didn't stop with child labor, not even close. With Aurora Leigh, she published something truly groundbreaking. A full-length novel written entirely in verse. I mean, think about that. This ambitious epic tackled the very definition of what a woman could be, focusing on her fight for artistic freedom and her own autonomy. So the story follows this young woman, Aurora, who completely rejects the life she's supposed to want, marriage, domestic life, and instead fights for her true ambition, to become a poet. With this one character, Barrett Browning basically created a blueprint for modern feminist literature, a woman who unapologetically demands a public career and her own artistic integrity. And I mean, the contrast here could not be more stark. On one side, you've got this suffocating little box of Victorian expectations for women. Focus on domestic life, be quiet, be subservient. And then on the other side, you have Aurora's absolutely radical ambition for a public career and a voice of her own. This poem wasn't just telling a story, it was a direct challenge to the entire system. So when you put all of these pieces together, the passionate lover, the fierce activist, the feminist visionary, what do you get? What is her ultimate legacy? Well, her impact is just undeniable. She seamlessly blended the personal with the political, proving that poetry could absolutely be a tool for revolution. She advocated for social justice, for women's rights, and child labor reform. She shattered old poetic forms, established a powerful female voice in a world dominated by men, and went on to inspire generations of feminist writers. It's an incredible list. And ultimately, this was her genius, right here. Her ability to blend her own personal experience with these huge, broader societal themes. It's why her work continues to resonate so strongly with readers, making it both timeless and, frankly, still incredibly relevant. And that really leaves us with one final thought. You think about a poet with her kind of fire, her keen sense of justice. If she were alive and writing today, what injustices do you think her poetry would confront? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to step inside the mind of a master psychologist, but he wasn't a doctor. He was a poet. We're diving into the incredible work of the Victorian writer Robert Browning. But let me just start with a question for you. What if a poem could do more than just, sound nice? What if it was actually a key that could unlock the deepest, darkest, sometimes terrifying thoughts of another person? I mean, what if a poem could let you listen in on a murderer's confession? Well, believe it or not, that's exactly the kind of thing Robert Browning did. We're talking about a guy from the 19th century, right? And he was an absolute master at getting inside the heads of his characters. He basically pioneered a new way for poetry to explore the human mind. You see, a lot of poets write about their own feelings. Browning, his genius was the total opposite. He stepped aside, he created these incredible characters and just let them talk. And wow, did they talk. They would reveal everything about themselves, their ambitions, their fears, and yeah, sometimes their most chilling secrets. So the big question is, how did he pull it off? I mean, how did he create these psychological portraits that feel so real? Well, he had a secret weapon. It was this literary device that, okay, he didn't invent it, but he perfected it like no one else. It's called the dramatic monologue. Now, don't let the name fool you. This isn't just some long, boring speech. No way. Think of it like a moment of pure drama, frozen in time. You have one character talking to a totally silent listener, and as they talk, we, the readers, get this incredible, unfiltered look at who they really are. Okay, so it breaks down into 3 key parts. First, you've got a single speaker. And remember, this is not Browning himself talking. It's a character. Second, there's a silent listener, someone who is right there in the scene but never says a word. Their presence is what gets the speaker going. And third, and this is the absolute magic of it, is what we call the unintentional reveal. The speaker is trying so hard to make themselves look good, to control the story, but in the process, they accidentally spill all their secrets and show us their true, often flawed character. And honestly, there is no better or more chilling example of this than Browning's most famous poem, My Last Duchess. So let's jump in and see how this whole thing works in action. So the poem kicks off with this line. You've got this powerful Italian duke, and he's showing a painting to a guy, an envoy, who's there to negotiate the duke's next marriage. Right away, we, the reader, become flies on the wall. We're basically eavesdropping, standing right there next to that silent envoy. And as the Duke starts talking about this painting of his late wife, he begins to complain about her. He says she was too friendly, that she smiled too much at other people. I mean, you can just feel the jealousy and this terrifying need for complete control in his words. It becomes clear he didn't want a partner. He wanted an object, something he could own. And then we get the punch to the gut, the chilling reveal. As he's trying to explain why he was so unhappy with her, the Duke just casually drops this line. He says he gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. Chills, right? He basically admits, without actually admitting it, that he had her killed. Why? Because she didn't act exactly the way he wanted her to. This is that unintentional reveal we were talking about in its most powerful, terrifying form. So, just like that, through his own words, the Duke's true nature is completely exposed. We see it all. His arrogance, this insane jealousy, the way he sees women as just possessions, and this cold, controlling mind hiding behind a mask of sophistication. It's a brilliant, brilliant illustration of just how powerful the dramatic monologue can be. But look, the Duke was just one character in Browning's huge gallery of complicated minds. He used this exact same technique to explore all kinds of different psychologies. And his range, wow, it was just incredible. In one poem, Porphyria's Lover, you're in the head of a man so obsessed that he kills his lover just to freeze a perfect moment in time. Then you have this massive epic, The Ring in the Book, where he tells the story of one murder from 12 different perspectives, making you question what truth even is. And then there's Andrea del Sarto, where you feel the quiet desperation of a talented painter who feels like a failure. I mean, every single poem is a deep dive into a different mind. So what's the takeaway here? Why are we still talking about this guy today? What's his lasting legacy? To put it simply, Browning totally changed the game for what poetry could be. His deep dives into the human mind, his perfection of the dramatic monologue, this stuff directly influenced pretty much all of modern literature. He showed future writers that a poem didn't have to be about grand battles. It could be a stage for the much quieter but just as intense battles happening inside our own heads. Look, if you remember just one thing from all of this, let it be this. Robert Browning taught poetry how to explore the mind. He gave it the tools to really get in there and dissect a personality, figure out motivations, and question morality. And he did it all by letting the characters hang themselves with their own words. And that really leaves us with one final, kind of unsettling thought. Browning cracked open the minds of his characters for us to poke around in. But it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If our own inner monologues, those private conversations we have with ourselves all day long, if those were turned into poems, what truths and what secrets would they reveal about us?
Today, we're diving into a poet who didn't just write about his time. In so many ways, he actually defined it. This is the story of a true giant of English literature, Alfred Lord Tennyson. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. I mean, just listen to those words. They're some of the most powerful ever written, and they perfectly capture the restless, ambitious spirit of the man we're talking about today. So let's get into it. So who wrote that line? None other than Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was a truly pivotal figure who became the poetic voice for an entire age of dramatic, sweeping change, a time when people were grappling with huge questions about progress and who they were. Now, this wasn't just some small-time gig. For over 4 decades during Queen Victoria's reign, Tennyson held the super prestigious title of Poet Laureate. And that wasn't just an honorary role, It gave him a national platform. It basically made him the official poetic commentator for the British Empire, right at the peak of its power. And you have to understand, his career landed smack dab in the middle of the Victorian era. This was a time of incredible steam-powered progress, but also just profound social upheaval. His work became a perfect mirror for all the anxieties and the hopes of his time. And this is where it gets really interesting. His poetry basically became this cultural battlefield. He just waded right into the biggest debates of the day, that huge clash between religious faith and shocking new scientific discoveries, and the constant tug of war between old traditions and the relentless march of modernity. Okay, so how on earth did he tackle these huge modern problems? Well, he did something kind of brilliant. He reached way back into the past. Tennyson had this absolute genius for taking ancient stories and making them feel totally new and urgent again. I mean, he took these stories of King Arthur and Camelot, tales that could have felt super old and dusty, and he just breathed new life into them in his massive work, Idylls of the King. He made them resonate deeply with his Victorian audience. And through these old stories, what he was doing was tapping directly into the Victorian mindset. Idylls of the King celebrated all those ideals they loved, like chivalry and honor, but it also voiced this deep, nagging fear they had that betrayal and moral rot could cause even the greatest society to crumble from the inside. And he didn't stop with King Arthur. He did the exact same thing with Greek myths. In his amazing poem, Ulysses, he doesn't just retell the hero's journey home. No, he asks a much more interesting question. What happens after the adventure is over? He pictures this hero back home, but he's restless, unfulfilled, and just itching for one last great quest. But, it wasn't just ancient myths that Tennyson used to explore these deep emotions. Maybe his most profound, most personal work came not from legend, but from just immense personal tragedy. So what happened was his best friend, Arthur Hallam, died suddenly. And it completely shattered him. This awful loss led him to write In Memoriam, which honestly is now seen as one of the greatest, most raw poems about grief ever written in English. And when I say he wrote about it, I mean he really wrote about it. The poem is massive. We're talking 131 different parts, written over a period of 17 years. That's not just a poem, it's practically a logbook of his entire journey through grief. So this type of poem is called an elegy, a piece about loss. But this was so much more than just a sad poem. It was this epic, soul-searching exploration of doubt, of sorrow, and that agonizing search for meaning when the world suddenly feels cruel and totally random. And that is why it hit so hard back then. The poem is brutally honest about the journey, all the way from raw despair and doubt to, finally, this hard-won reconciliation with faith. For a Victorian audience that was having its own crisis of faith, this was incredibly powerful stuff. All right, let's switch gears a little. You might think of him as this traditional establishment guy, right? But what's really surprising is how he tackled one of the most forward-thinking issues of his time, women's rights. He wrote this poem called The Princess, and the story was, for its time, totally groundbreaking. It's about a princess named Ida who basically says no thanks to marriage and instead founds a university just for women, totally separate from the world of men. So let's just look at the contrast here. It's night and day. On one side, you have the typical Victorian rules. Women belong in the home. On the other, you've got Princess Ida's radical vision,
A world where women live for themselves, use their minds, and decide their own destinies. So this all leads to a really fascinating question, doesn't it? Was Tennyson some kind of early feminist? Now the poem's ending is, well, it's complicated. But the very fact that he was exploring these ideas shows he was way more complex on social issues than a lot of people give him credit for. So what's the big takeaway here? Why does a poet who died well over a century ago still matter to us? Let's break down why his legacy is so enduring. So why do we still care? Well, his legacy is huge, and it breaks down into a few key things. First, he was just an absolute master of the English language. Second, he wrote about the big stuff, the timeless human experiences, love, loss, that search for purpose we all go through. And he had that amazing trick of blending old myths with modern worries, capturing the very soul of a rapidly changing world. And that leaves us with one final thought, something that connects his time directly to ours. In our own age of crazy fast technological and social change, facing our own anxieties about the future, his question is still our question. How do we strive to seek, to find, and... All right, so let's get right into it. We're talking about a guy who didn't just write plays. Nope, he took all the drama, all the secrets of 18th century high society and just plopped it right on center stage for everyone to see. His name? Richard Brinsley Sheridan. So let me ask you something. What if your reputation was like money? Something you could earn, trade, and have completely wiped out by just a few whispers? Sounds pretty modern, right? Like something straight out of today's internet culture. But here's the thing, this isn't a new problem. Not at all. It's the exact world Richard Brinsley Sheridan was taking apart more than 2 centuries ago.
All right, so who was this guy anyway? Well, Richard Brinsley Sheridan was this incredible talent from Ireland. I mean, he wasn't just a playwright, he was a poet, a politician, a real jack of all trades for his era. And what made him famous was his wit. It was absolutely razor sharp. He had this knack for watching the rich and powerful and just perfectly, hilariously, calling them out on all their nonsense. And wow, did he rise fast. I mean, it was meteoric. Born in Dublin in 1751, and by 1775, bam, his first big play, The Rivals, is a total smash hit. Then, just 2 years after that, The School for Scandal drops, and he becomes a household name. And get this, by 1780, he's so influential that he gets elected to Parliament. It really shows you how culture and politics were just completely woven together back then. Okay, so let's take a closer look at that first big hit, The Rivals, to really see how he did it. This play is a classic comedy of manners, which is basically a fancy way of saying it makes fun of the absurd romantic ideas and social games of the super rich. The whole setup is just primed for total chaos. First up, you've got Lydia Languish. She's so obsessed with the dramatic love stories in her books that she's decided she'll only marry a poor guy in a forbidden romance. So, what does a wealthy nobleman like Captain Jack Absolute do? Naturally, he disguises himself as a broke romantic soldier named Ensign Beverly. And just to make things even crazier, we have her aunt, the legendary Mrs. Malaprop, meddling in everything. And right there, that's the core of the whole thing. Mistaken identity is what makes the whole plot tick. But you know, Sheridan wasn't just going for cheap laughs. No way. He was making a really clever point about how fake and performative courtship had become. He's showing us the ridiculous things people would do just to live up to some storybook idea of love. And this is where you really see his genius for creating characters. Take Mrs. Malaprop. She's so iconic that she has a word named after her. Malapropism. That's when you use a similar sounding but totally wrong word, and it's hilarious. So when she says someone is the very pineapple of politeness, what she means is pinnacle. It's more than just a funny line, right? It's a brilliant way to satirize people trying to sound smarter than they are.
Okay, so if The Rivals was a sharp jab, then The School for Scandal was an absolute knockout punch. This is his masterpiece, the one he's most famous for. And here he goes even deeper, taking a hard look at hypocrisy and the way gossip can just destroy people. So the whole story really revolves around 2 brothers. First, there's Charles Surface. Everyone thinks he's a mess, he's got a bad reputation, but underneath it all, he's actually a good, genuine person. Then there's Joseph. Oh, Joseph has a spotless reputation, a perfect public image, but behind closed doors, he's a total hypocrite. And that's the central question of the play. What's real? The image you project or who you actually are? So what keeps this whole world of fakes and phonies spinning? One word:
Gossip. Sheridan shows us that gossip isn't just harmless talk, it's power. It's a weapon. You can use it to destroy someone's reputation and build up your own.
And sitting right in the middle of this web of lies is the perfectly, and I mean perfectly named Lady Sneerwell. She's the main antagonist, the puppet master. She gets her power and, frankly, her enjoyment from cooking up nasty rumors to tear people down. And her number one target? Our hero with the bad reputation, Charles.
And Sheridan breaks down exactly how it works, like a formula for social destruction. Step 1, Lady Sneerwell plants a lie. Step 2, the other gossips grab it and run with it, spreading it like wildfire and adding their own details. Step 3, poor Charles's reputation is left in shreds. The rest of the play is this wild, funny, and kind of stressful race against time to see if the truth can finally catch up to the lies.
So, what's the big deal? Why are we still talking about plays written hundreds of years ago? Well, it's because Sheridan wasn't just writing about his own time, he was writing about us. He was writing about human nature. And honestly, his insights feel like they could have been written yesterday.
Let's just boil it down to the big themes. First, how incredibly fragile a reputation can be. Second, the poison of hypocrisy. Third, the scary idea that gossip can become more powerful than the truth itself, creating its own reality. And finally, that timeless question, what matters more, how people see you or who you really are? And this is the moment it all just clicks, right? Just swap out the fancy 18th century parlors for your social media feed. Swap out the whispering socialites for anonymous trolls and viral threads. Suddenly you realize Sheridan's world of scandal and reputation management, it is our world. It's the internet. So I'll leave you with this question. In our world of cancel culture, online pylons, and carefully crafted Instagram lives, aren't we all just characters in a reboot of Sheridan's play? Think about it. Which part are you playing? The gossip? The victim? Or maybe the hypocrite with the perfect public profile? It's definitely something to think about.
You know that feeling you get from a good haunted house story? That creaking floorboard, the shadow in the window, the sense that the building itself has dark secrets? It feels like these stories have been around forever, right? But what if I told you they haven't? They had to start somewhere. And believe me, the story of how it all started is just incredible. So let's get right into it. So where do these stories come from? I mean, when you picture a classic horror movie or book, what pops into your head? For most of us, it's something like this, right? A big, creepy, crumbling castle. We're talking about some really specific, really familiar ideas here. Like, you've got these ancient curses, the kind that doom a family for generations. And then there are the secret passages, always dusty, always hidden behind a painting or a giant bookshelf. And of course, you can't forget the ghosts themselves. The spirits of old aristocrats who just can't seem to move on. These are like the absolute building blocks of horror that we all just know. But here's the crazy part. What if I told you that pretty much all of this was cooked up by one guy? Yeah, no joke. The whole genre of gothic horror, the blueprint for every haunted house story you've ever loved, it all points back to one single book from one guy way back in 1764. So who was this architect of terror? All right, let's meet him. His name was Horace Walpole. And this 18th century dude, maybe without even fully realizing it, kicked off a genre that would be scaring the heck out of us for centuries. Now, don't get the wrong idea. Walpole wasn't just some guy cranking out scary stories in his basement. He was this incredibly smart, well-rounded intellectual, a writer, an art historian, even a politician. And get this, he was living during the Age of Enlightenment, a time when everyone was all about logic and reason and science. But while everybody else was looking to the future, Walpole, he was obsessed with the past, the dark, the mysterious, the supernatural parts of it. And that obsession, well, that's what made him a legend. And that entire legacy really kicks off with one specific book. So let's do this. Let's break down the novel that literally started it all, The Castle of Otranto. Yep, this is the one, dropped in 1764, and pretty much everyone agrees it is the very first Gothic novel. Seriously, before this book, there was nothing else like it. It was a total, complete game changer. And what's so cool is he basically created a recipe for it. It's all right here. You start with one creepy, fallen apart castle. You mix in some supernatural stuff and a good old-fashioned family curse. Then you throw in a desperate, evil lord and a totally pure and good heroine. And you let the whole thing simmer in this atmosphere of non-stop terror and suspense. Sound familiar? Yeah, it really should. And people went wild for it. I mean, the impact was immediate. This mix of scary stuff, a little romance, and the supernatural, it just grabbed readers in a way nothing had before. It wasn't just a hit book, it became the template, the literal instruction manual that writers would use for generations to come. But here's the thing, Walpole was absolutely not a one-hit wonder, not even close. The guy was a machine. His mind was just always going, digging into history, art, and drama with the exact same energy he brought to his big, spooky novel. Just look at this timeline. It really shows you what I'm talking about. In the same handful of years that he drops the genre-defining book, he's also publishing major works on art history and famous people. He was just fascinated by the past. Didn't matter if it was the lives of painters or the super dark secrets in a tragic play like The Mysterious Mother, which, by the way, dealt with some pretty shocking stuff for the 1700s. And this Gothic obsession, it wasn't just something he wrote about. The man lived it. He literally designed and built his own house, called Strawberry Hill, to be this incredible Gothic revival villa. It was like his own personal, real-life castle of Otranto. He built the world he was writing about. I mean, the guy was just unstoppable. Outside of his stories, he was a serious historian, questioning what everyone thought they knew. His personal letters, they're now considered these amazing, funny windows into life back then. He was a huge art and antique collector. And he even went back to his own book, to Otranto, and added a new introduction that basically laid out the rules for the genre he had just accidentally invented. How cool is that? So, okay, after a life packed with so much different and influential stuff, what's the bottom line? What's his real legacy? What's the ghost of Horace Walpole that still lingers today? It's actually pretty simple. Every single time you watch a haunted house movie, or you read a thriller with a supernatural twist, or even play a survival horror game, you're basically hanging out with the ghost of Horace Walpole. That recipe he came up with, the creepy old building, the deep dark family secret, the ghostly threat, that's not just a pert of horror. It is the DNA of modern horror. He wrote the rulebook for the stuff that still gives us nightmares today. And that really just leaves us with one last question to chew on. Think about all the greats, Stephen King, Shirley Jackson. Think about the classics, like Dracula or The Haunting of Hill House. Now think about your own favorite scary stories. Which ones do you now realize are actually haunted by Horace Walpole?